morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. We're going to hear some more expert evidence today from the person who's been instructed to look at the electrical aspects of this matter. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thank you, sir. May I call Dr. Duncan Glover?
Thank you.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. You can sit down. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Glover. Sit down and make yourself comfortable.
Thank you, sir.
Right. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. First of all, would you mind confirming your name for the record?
Yes, my name is John Duncan Glover.
Dr. Glover, thank you very much for attending to give evidence today. First of all, can you confirm that you provided a report dated the 15th of October of this year, a damage assessment memorandum also dated the 15th of October of this year, and an addendum dated the 16th of November of this year? Is that right?
Yes, 3 separate documents.
Thank you. For the avoidance of doubt, although headed draft, both your report and the damage assessment memorandum are in fact the final versions. Is that right?
That's correct.
Do you confirm that the facts and matters set out in the report, the damage assessment memorandum, and the addendum are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I do.
And is it right that you have provided the report, the damage assessment memorandum, and the addendum in the same way as you would have provided those documents to a court?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. And finally, does your report, damage assessment, memorandum and addendum set out your opinions on the matters relevant to this inquiry?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Dr. Glover, the first issue I'd like to cover with you is your qualifications. And first of all, you set out those qualifications at section 1.3 of your report at page 4 and at appendix D of that report. And now, I'm not going to go through all of that, but I'd like to pick out some key points. First of all, is it right that you're a registered professional engineer in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts?
Yes, that's correct.
And since 2004, you've been the president and principal engineer of Failure Electrical LLC?
Yes, sir.
And that you hold a BS degree in electrical engineering from the University of Massachusetts?
Yes, in Amherst, Massachusetts. Correct.
And that you also hold an MS degree in electrical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology?
Yes, that was in 1968. That's correct.
And in addition, you were awarded a PhD in electrical engineering from MIT in 1971?
Yes, sir.
Is it right that you're a life senior member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers?
Yes, sir.
And you're also a member of the National Fire Protection Association?
I am.
And that between 1977 and 1990, you were a tenured associate professor in the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department of Northeastern University?
Yes, I started out as an assistant professor, but I worked myself up to a tenured associate professor.
Thank you. And finally, you were also a principal engineer at Exponent Analysis Associates for a period of time?
Yes, for 14 years, up to 1990, I was at Exponent.
Thank you. Now, the next topic I'd like to discuss with you is the purpose of your report. Now, is it right that the purpose of the report, the memorandum and the addendum is to assess the fire origin within an area that has already been established by other investigators retained by the inquiry?
Yes, that's correct.
And as set out in section 1.1 of your report at page 3, non-electrical fire origins are outside the scope of your expertise. Is that right?
Yes, I'm not an expert in non-electrical fires, only electrical fires.
And in relation to the identification of the area of origin of the initial fire within flat 16, as set out in section 2 of your report at pages 6 to 8, you've relied upon the analyses of Professors Bisbee and Nick Dade. Is that right?
Yes, I have.
And accordingly, is it right to say that you've taken, for the purpose of your reports, the memorandum and the addendum, the area of origin to be the southeast end of the kitchen, between the kitchen window and the edge of the cooker?
Flat 16, that's
Yes.
correct.
And mindful of the limits of your expertise, have you seen any other evidence which casts doubt over their identification of the area of origin?
No, sir.
Thank you. Now, the next topic I'd like to discuss with you is your examination of the physical evidence. Now, first of all, and as set out in the damage assessment memorandum, is it correct that you inspected 14 exhibits that had been retrieved from flat 16?
I expected many more exhibits than that, but there were 14 exhibits that are especially referred to in my damage assessment memo.
Thank you. And in broad terms, the exhibits you examined were a variety of electrical components and wiring. Is that a fair, if broad, summary?
Yes.
And is it right that your examination also relied upon a range of technologies, including CT scans, scanning electron microscopy, and energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy?
Yes,
Apologies.
as well as optical microscopy.
And the range of technologies you relied upon set out at section 1.1 of your memorandum, is that right?
The damage assessment memo, yes.
Yes. Now, the next topic I'd like to discuss with you is arc damage. Is it fair to say that the principal object of examining the exhibits was to determine the existence of arc damage?
That was the principle. I did have some other side issues in terms of counting wire strands via the CT scan and looking at some wire connectors. But the primary object one of the primary objects was to evaluate the possibility of arc damage for the 14 exhibits.
Now, in that respect, could I ask you to turn to section 2.1 of the damage assessment memorandum? And it's up on the screen, Dr. Glover, which may be easier than trying to plough through the various files. Now, before we go into the meat of that particular section, would you agree that the basic starting point is that damage to electrical components can occur as a result of electrical and non-electrical events?
Yes.
And that whether an event was electrical or non-electrical can indicate whether the damage was part of the cause or the result of a fire. Is that a fair summary?
There's two options, yes, two possibilities there.
And is it right to say that electrical damage can indicate abnormal electrical activity?
That it would, yes.
That was capable of causing a fire?
It's capable of causing a fire and also could be the result of a fire.
Now, before we turn to the characteristics of arc damage, could you help us with an explanation of some basic technical terms that you refer to in your report and other documents? First of all, and at its most basic, what's a short circuit?
A short circuit is an abnormal electrical condition where the electrical current becomes much higher than what is normally expected for the device that's carrying electrical current. It's usually caused by an insulation failure, a failure of the electrical insulation that protects the wires and the components. And normally you would have a very high current that could possibly trip a circuit breaker, cause a circuit breaker to operate, or a fuse to blow.
Thank you. Secondly, what's a high current ground fault?
Excuse me?
What's a high current ground fault?
Okay. That would be a short circuit that involves current flowing from an energized wire, a live wire, to a grounding wire or some metallic path to ground. It gets out of the normal path of electricity. Normally, electricity will flow down the live wire from a consumer unit or a fuse box through an appliance or an electrical device, and then will return through a neutral wire. But when you have a problem, a short circuit involving ground, the current is diverted to another path, either the grounding wire or some electrical metallic path to ground.
Thank you. And finally, in your report, you refer occasionally to an overcurrent. What's an overcurrent?
It would be not as severe as a short circuit, but it would be higher than the normal load current that a device carries.
Now, in relation to a short circuit or a high current ground fault, can we say that the energy released by these events is sufficient to melt metals, thereby creating a gap of sorts?
Yes, especially if there is an arc involved, where the electricity flows out of the wire through insulation or through an air gap, and you have a luminous discharge. It becomes very, very hot. Temperatures in thousands of degrees that are capable of melting metals such as aluminum, copper, even steel.
And it's that temperature and its consequences which are the primary consequences of what I've called the gap.
Yes.
Now, you note that abnormal electrical activity is often identifiable after a fire because it leads to arc damage. Is that a fair, if basic summary?
That is, yes.
Now, again, I turned earlier on to section 2.1 of your damage assessment memorandum, and if I could ask you to look at the bottom of page 5, and there you've identified 9 of the characteristics of arc damage. The 9th is over leaf at the bottom of that page. Now, if we could just go through those. First of all, sharp demarcation between damaged and undamaged area of the energized copper conductor. Again, can you give us a brief explanation as to how that result is caused?
Yes. First, I would say that these 9 items are taken from a document entitled the National Fire Protection Association, an FPA document that covers a guide to fire explosions. And there is a chapter on electricity in that document, and this is excerpted. These 8, maybe there's a 9th one on the next page, items are excerpted from the NFPA guide.
And as I understand it, this list of 9 characteristics is not exhaustive, it's illustrative only.
That's correct.
And again, looking at the first characteristic, the sharp demarcation between the damaged and undamaged area of the energized copper conductor, how does that happen in straightforward terms?
Yes, well, as I mentioned, in the area of the arc, the temperatures can be very, very high, thousands of degrees centigrade, Celsius. But those temperatures are also very localized for a very small area in the vicinity of the arc. So that if you go perhaps a centimeter away from the arc location, you will not have the melting and the arc damage. And so that's what we call it, a sharp line of demarcation between the arced area where the melted or resolidified metal is observed, and yet a short distance away, centimeter or less, no damage.
And can we take it from the fact that the sharp demarcation is the first of these characteristics, that it's the principal or most important characteristic of arc damage?
It's the one that I look for. It's the most readily recognizable characteristic.
And as we go through the list, number 2 is the round, smooth shape of artifact. Again, can you explain in sort of layman's terms what that indicates?
Well, very often when you melt copper, say, from a wire, that will result in a round, what we call a copper bead. The copper strands on the wire, if it happens to be a stranded wire, will melt, and then they will re-solidify into a round copper bead.
And indeed, later when we come to look at photos of certain exhibits, we'll see illustrations of copper beading, I think. Is that
We
right?
will. Yes.
Number 3 is localized point of contact. Again, that flows from the explanation you've previously given as to what arc damage is, I assume.
Yes, it's very localized.
And again, number 4, identifiable corresponding area of damage on the opposing neutral conductor or opposing grounded metal surface. Again, that flows from the elemental explanation you've given of arc damage.
That's maybe a fundamental concept of electric circuits, where when current flows, it always flows in closed paths. So normally current will flow from, say, your consumer unit or a fuse box down a live wire, and it will return after it passes through the load through a neutral wire back to the consumer unit. So you have current flowing in a closed path. When you have arcing, the current gets out of the bag, so to speak. It flows through an abnormal path. You may have a luminous discharge. The arc may be flowing through air or gas or tracking through some damaged insulation. That current still has to return to the consumer unit. And that's why you will often see a corresponding identifiable area of arc damage on a return wire or some metallic path.
And again, that point is relevant when we come to look at the various appliances and remnants of wiring that you examined for the purposes of the memorandum.
Yes.
Yeah. Number 5 is locally enlarged grain size. Number 6, resolidification waves. In respect of number 6, can you explain that for us in layman's terms, what that characteristic involves?
Okay. Normally, I don't look at 6 too much, but and that's described in some of the appendices and documents that are associated with the NFPA Guide to Fire Explosions. But when there is a melting of, in this case we're talking about copper, and then a resolidification, that it there will tend to be waves on the resolidified copper.
Is it a characteristic that's relevant to your analysis set out in the report and the other documents?
I did not particularly look at any resolidification waves.
Looking at number 7, copper drawing lines visible outside the damaged area. Again, can you give us a brief explanation as to why that's looked for as a characteristic?
Yes, as I mentioned, when you're a short distance away from the arc damage, you don't have arc damage. You will have the copper wires if they're stranded. When copper wires are manufactured, they will be manufactured. Often there will be visible lines on these copper wires as manufactured, and you can often see that close to the arc damage. Again, then it ties back to item 1. You get a fine line of demarcation. So if you look at the wires that are close, the copper wires that are close to the arc but not damaged, you can often see these lines that were part of the manufacturing process of the copper wires.
Thank you. And in respect of 8, small beads and divots over a limited area, again, am I right in assuming that would be a consequence of the cause of the arc damage that you outlined when explaining the nature of arc damage previously?
Yes, and there are examples of that, photographs that I have taken from the NFPA guide that show the beads, copper beads, and divots or notches in the wires as a result of arc damage.
Thank you. And Paul, if we could turn over the page to the top of page 6, the 9th and final characteristic, high internal porosity when viewed in cross-section. Again, can you give us a brief explanation of why that's looked for as a characteristic of arc damage?
This is a more recent phenomena in addition to the current edition of the NFPA guide. I'm using, I believe, the 17th edition. And some researchers have looked at arc beads, copper beads that have arced, and they have cross-sectioned them in the laboratory and found that when you have arc beads caused by arc damage, that the cross-section of those beads will show a high porosity, very porous, as opposed to fire damage. In NFPA guide, they don't, when they talk about a fire damage copper, they call it a globule as opposed to a bead. Still around, looks very much the similar. But when you cross-section a fire-heated globule of copper, you don't get the high porosity that you get from an arc-damaged bead.
Thank you, Dr. Glover. Now, you adverted to the difference between the characteristics of arc damage and characteristics of fire damage. And if we could ask you to turn to section 2.2 of your memorandum, which is at JDGM 00003_0010. And we can see in the top of that section, you say copper conductors may be damaged before or during a fire by other than electrical means, and often these effects are distinguishable from arc damage. When exposed to fire or glowing embers, copper conductors may melt. The melting temperature of pure copper is 1085 degrees centigrade or 1984 degrees Fahrenheit. At first, there is a blistering and distortion of the surface, as shown in figure 8. And if Paul could de-amplify that and then amplify figure 8 for us. and it may be fairly obvious, Dr. Glover, but see on the big screen behind your shoulder, would you mind identifying for us the blistering and distortion to which you are referring to in the preceding paragraph?
Yes, sir. Again, this is a figure that's taken right out of the NFPA guide to fire explosions. And you can see.
Don't worry, there's a
They're quite
microphone
good
there.
microphones.
That'll work.
We don't have to be too close.
Thank you, sir. So you can see instead of a copper wire that's been fire heated, you can see the blistering and surface deformations. These are copper that is just beginning to see the effects of a high fire heated copper. Blistering along the surface of the copper conductor.
Thank you, Dr. Glover. Now, after blistering and distortion, what happens next?
And then with additional fire heating, you will get what is called a thinning of the wires. The wire's diameter will become thinning. That's sometimes called necking. And you will also see the formation. We don't call them beads, we call them globules, but they're very similar. They're round globules of copper that has melted. You can see them in the figure here.
Yes, and I think if Paul, first of all, amplifies figure 9, and then if you could identify the globules for us.
Yes, you can see a globule here.
Yes.
It's a round artifact of copper that has melted and then resolidified. And you can also see the thinning of the copper wire close to that globule, as opposed to back further where the wire maintains its original diameter.
Thank you, Dr. Glover. Now, looking at how you've summarized the differences between electrical damage and non-electrical damage, is it fair to say that the most important characteristic of non-electrical fire damage is that, in contrast to arc damage, the damage is spread over a larger area and there's no sharp line of demarcation? Is that a fair, if general, summary? That's
correct. If you can imagine a fire attacking a copper wire, it wouldn't be as localized as an arc, which is very localized.
Now, when you've determined that electrical arc damage has occurred to a segment of copper wire, is it right that your next step is to identify the origin of the segment by determining whether the following features of the wire match features at each possible location of origin, such as strands? Is that right?
Yes.
Now, the first stage of that appears to be, on the basis of your report, a simple sort of counting of the number of strands. Is that right?
That's one method, yes.
And then the next stage appears to be measuring the diameter of those strands.
Yes, sir.
Now, in addition to examining the exhibits themselves for physical damage, is it right that you've also looked at other sources of evidence that have helped you?
Yes.
And first and foremost, you've looked at the witness evidence of the former occupants of flat 16. Is that right?
I have.
And you've also looked at what evidence can be deduced from the associated circuit breakers in the fuse box. Is that right?
Yes, I call it the consumer unit, but that would be the fuse box.
Okay. And you've also looked at whether the fuse in a relevant appliance or device's plug is intact or blown.
Yes, the fuses were looked at and examined for the various appliances to determine whether they were intact, as you say, or blown.
And finally, you've looked at the extent and pattern of any heat damage to a particular appliance or device.
Yes, to all of the devices that were in the area of fire origin that were established by the other investigators, Professor Bisbee and Nick Dade.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Glover, when we come on to it, we're going to have much discussion of the relevant circuit breakers and the main switch on the fuse box itself. But before we come on to that, can you help us that in relation to the fuse box consumer unit, why is it relevant whether a particular circuit breaker was found in the off position or not?
Well, there's a very interesting event that occurred that the occupant of the flat 16, Mr. Kabidi, I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly, before he vacated the apartment, he turned off the main switch at the consumer unit so that any other device at that consumer unit that was found in the off position would have had to have operated before Mr. Capiti turned off the main switch. When he turns off the main switch, the consumer unit is now de-energized, and there's no way that a circuit breaker could operate automatically after he does that.
And so it provides us with a snapshot of the circuits that had been tripped before the fuse box was turned off. And that's its importance. Is that a fair summary?
That's correct. And when you say the word tripped, I mean that would be a circuit breaker that operates to the off position automatically. We say in the engineering lingo that means the circuit breaker tripped.
Thank you. And finally, in relation to setting out the basics, in section 10.3 of your report, and we don't need to go to it unless you want to, you refer to evidence of, quotes, other abnormal electrical activity, close quotes, which appears to be evidence above and beyond arc damage. What evidence are you referring to here? What particular class of evidence are you thinking of here?
I'm sorry, are we in my report,
yeah, in your report,
or the damage assessment memo?
It's in your report. So it's section 10.3 of your report. It's at page 39, and the reference is JDGR 00001 underscore 0039, and it's point 3. So there's no evidence of arc damage or other abnormal electrical activity. Now, other abnormal... Do you have it there on the screen, Dr. Glover? It's easier if you look at it on the screen, I think.
Okay.
And you see there 10.3.
Yes, sir.
And you refer there to no evidence of, in sub-paragraph 3, you say there's no evidence of arc damage or other abnormal electrical activity. Can you help us? It's just a general question. What other abnormal electrical activity are you referring to there above and beyond evidence of arc damage?
The main thing is the arc damage. In this case, copper wires that have melted in locations and are determined to be arc damage as opposed to fire damage. There are other abnormal electrical events. If you have, for example, printed circuit boards in the device, you could look at components on the board, capacitors or other electrical components, and look for arc damage or other types of abnormal electrical activity. Perhaps, for example, if the capacitor is punctured, that there was an internal event that caused a puncture that you could observe in that component. And you could also look for something called electrical tracking along a printed circuit board. So it would be a matter of examining the electrical components in addition to the wires.
Okay, that's very clear, thank you.
Dr. Glover, forgive me, I think you're getting a bit too close to the microphone.
Okay.
It'll work very well at this sort of range.
Thank you,
It'll save you leaning forward as well. All right?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Glover, thank you. The next topic I'd like to come on to is evidence of electrical arc damage itself. And so we'll now turn to the principal points of the analysis which you've summarised in the memorandum. Now, starting at the outset, correct me if I'm wrong, but your essential conclusion is that only 2 of the exhibits that you examined showed evidence of electrical arc damage. Is that correct?
Yes, there were 2 exhibits, MJS1 and JDG1, that I concluded suffered arc damage. All of the remaining 12 exhibits did not suffer arc damage.
Thank you. Now, turning to exhibit MJS1, starting with the most basic question, what is MJS1?
Okay, MJS1 is, first I'll go to it, perhaps I could show a photograph of it. And
yes,
that would be
that's going to be probably the easiest reference is that one which has just come up on the screen.
And in my damage assessment memo, you will see MJS1, which are basically 2 copper wires. There is one segment that is approximately 10 centimeters in length. There is a scale there, the yellow scale that shows one of the wire segments. There is a separate wire segment, but the interesting one is the 10 centimeter length wire that has a fused area. What I mean by fused is there There is melted copper between the two wires that is to be examined, and once I examined that, I determined that it was arc damage.
Now, stopping there, might I invite you to do this in the old-fashioned way, and pointing on the big screen above you, can you just identify for all of us the area which you consider to be fused?
Yes, so here is this 10 centimeter length of, approximately 10 centimeter length of two wires. Both of them are stranded. By the way, each wire has 24 strands in it. But approximately 1.5 centimeters from this end, there is an area. It's kind of blurry here, so there will be other microscopic photos that will show the fused area. There is, the two wires are affixed to each other, and there is melted and then resolidified copper that fuses the two wires together.
Thank you. Apologies for asking you to get up and down, but sometimes it's easier just to point on the screen. Now, can you remember from where MJS1 was recovered within flat 16?
Yes, it was recovered in one of the bedrooms, and it was recovered some 27 days after the 14 June 2017 fire.
Okay. Now, looking at the composition of MJS1 itself, you've adverted to some of this, but you described it as consisting of two stranded copper wire segments of approximately 10, 11 centimeters length, with a separate stranded copper wire segment approximately 5 centimeters in length. Is that a fair summary of its composition?
And that's shown in the photo here on the screen.
Now, and am I right in saying that approximately 15 millimeters from the end of one segment, there's the fused area of 3 millimeters in length to which you've just referred?
Yes, 15 millimeters or 1.5 centimeters away from the right end is shown in this screen.
And the precise dimensions of the fused area is 3 millimeters or thereabouts?
The width of the fused area, yes.
And can we now turn to Exhibit JDG1? Now, in respect of that, can you give us a basic explanation? What is JDG1, first of all?
Okay, and you've gone to figure A2.
Yep.
Actually, is this out of my report or out of my damage assessment memo?
This is the report.
Okay. So, again, we have copper wires, and there's a close-up of it.
And looking at its composition, is it right to say that it consists of stranded copper wire segments of approximately 4 centimeters in length?
Yes. Yeah. And you can see them along. There's actually two wires on the outside, and there are segments of wire, a third wire in between. And then there is a cross wire here with a, now we'll call, you can see a copper bead, resolidified copper bead at one end of the JDG1.
And it's the site of the copper bead. Is that the evidence of arc damage upon which you rely?
It is, yes.
Thank you. Right, now can I turn to the question of strand counts in respect of both these exhibits. First of all, am I right in understanding that you've measured both the strand count and the diameter of both of these exhibits?
Yes.
And if I ask you to turn to section 4.4 of your report, and the penultimate paragraph on page 20 of your report, Paul, the reference you have, but is JDGR 0000001 underscore 0020. And I think what you set out there in the penultimate and final paragraph of the relevant dimensions, strand count first of all, and the dimensions of the two exhibits. Is that right?
Are you referring to the last paragraph on page 20?
The penultimate first of all.
The penultimate,
yeah.
the next to last, okay.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
Both MJS1, which we looked at previously, and now JDG1, both of them, each wire in those two exhibits each one has 24 strands. Those are 24 stranded wires. We also measured the wire diameter two different ways, using calipers in the laboratory and using the caliper tool at the CT scanner at, you say Nikon, I say Nikon, up in Tring, and we measured the wire diameter two ways, and there is some variability in diameter depending on how tight you push your calibers against the copper, or how you set the cursor on the CT caliper tool. But we were measuring diameters approximately 0.16 up to 0.18 millimeters for not only MJS1 but JDG1.
Thank you. And turning now to the final paragraph on that page, and you say, as noted in section 8.2, exhibit MJD38, the medium-sized freezer includes wires with 24 strands and strand diameter 0.16 and 0.18 meters. Also, as noted in section 12.9, exhibits BPS3 and BPS4, components of the fridge freezer, include wires with 24 strands and strand diameter of 0.16 and 0.18 meters. Can you help us as to why you've set out that information there, why you consider it to be relevant?
Well, the question is, where did we find wires with 24 strands? As I said, MJS1 was found lying on the floor in the bedroom some 27 days after the fire. And JDG1, by the way, was found inside of, I found that in my one of my April inspections at Bureau Veritas down in Bermondsey area of London. That was found, I found that inside of the medium-sized freezer. Okay, so now I was interested in where you might find other wires, particularly in the area of fire argon within flat 16, that have 24 strands, like these two arc damage exhibits. And I found them in two locations. I found them in the medium-sized freezer, for example, the power supply cord, or what you might call the main supply flex, as well as other wires within the medium-sized freezer. And I also found 24-strand wires within the fridge freezer of flat 16.
Thank you. Now, the next topic I'm going to come on to is the consumer unit and the circuit breakers. Now, if I could ask Paul to bring up a photograph, which is at JDGR 000 0016_0001. Now, Dr. Glover, if I could ask Paul to turn the page. And Dr. Glover, it's probably easier if I ask you to talk us through these photographs, and you can identify those features which you consider to be pertinent. First of all, what does figure A1-1 show us?
Yes, both of these figures, A11, show the consumer unit, you might call it the fuse box, from flat 16. These are not my photos. These are photos that I have that were in the file. And on the left side is the main switch, this red switch here, and that's the switch that Mr. Kabidi turned off as he vacated flat 16 on the night of the fire. And then there are various circuit breakers to the right of the main switch. There are better photographs as we moved on. But two of them in particular were found in the off position, two of these circuit breakers. One was the circuit breaker for what we call circuit 7, which fed the sockets in the kitchen of flat 16. There will be better photos of that. Circuit 7 is just to the right of this, what we call an RCCB circuit breaker.
And is circuit 7 that?
Yes.
The penultimate from the right-hand side?
Yes, the last one is circuit 8, which was not off. Circuit 8 was in the on position. The second circuit breaker that was found in the off position was just to the left of the circuit 7 breaker, and that is a special breaker. It's called an RCCB, a residual current circuit breaker. It's designed to detect small ground currents that get out of the normal path flow of electricity.
Okay. Now, if I can take a step back and just ask you a question about circuit 7. You mentioned that it served the sockets in the kitchen. Is it right to say that the pertinent feature of circuit 7 for our purposes is that was the circuit upon which the large fridge freezer was plugged into?
I'm sorry, that was the circuit that what?
The large fridge freezer was plugged into.
Yes, it was. The fridge freezer was plugged into circuit 7 within the kitchen of flat 16.
Okay. And if I can ask you now to go to, probably over the page is probably easier now. Again, the top photograph, figure A13, gives a close-up shot of the main switch in the off position. Is that right?
That's correct. That's the red one.
Thank you. And if we can remove that, Paul. And then if we can amplify figure A1-4, and we see the second in from the right-hand side is the circuit breaker for circuit 7. Is that right?
Yes, and it's in the off position.
Yes. And again, moving leftwards, we see the RCCB also in the off position.
Correct.
Thank you. Now, Paul, if we can put those photographs down, and if I may ask you, Paul, now to turn to section 3.4 of Dr. Glover's report, which is at JDGR 000100010. And it's section 3.4, which is the bottom of that page. And Paul, could I ask you to amplify that? Under the heading Circuit Breaker Operation Timing and Sequence, you say this: it is most likely that the two circuit breakers, 6th and 7th circuit breakers to the right of the main switch, found in the off position, operated automatically, tripped, as a result of a short circuit, overcurrent, rather than being manually operated to the off position as follows. First, Mr. Kabedi stated that he turned off the main red electricity switch. His, and Paul, if we can, interview statements do not state that he turned off any other circuit breaker. Second, there is no record that any fire brigade personnel, fire investigator or other person manually turned off these two circuit breakers. And third, evidence of arc damages to exhibits MJS1 and JDG1 provides an indication of a short circuit sufficient to trip the 32 amps MCB for circuit number 7. And Paul, if you can amplify the next paragraph for me. And after Mr. Kabedi turned off the main switch, all electrical circuits in flat 16 were disconnected from the electric utility power source. No circuit breaker could have tripped after the main switch was turned off. That is, both of the circuit breakers that tripped had to have tripped off during the initiation or early stages of the fire before Mr. Kabedi turned off the main switch. Now, stopping there, does that remain your view?
Yes, and that's a key element of my conclusions. That was a clue that was very important to me, that we have two circuit breakers that tripped early on in the fire or in the initiation of the fire, and those would provide a clue to find out what caused those circuit breakers to trip and would lead me to the fire origin.
Now, flowing from that, you set out on page 11 the two possible sequences for the tripping of the two circuit breakers. Now, if you could just talk us through, first of all, sequence 1.
Okay, so we got two tripped circuit breakers, the RCCB and circuit 7 for the kitchen. And they could have both tripped simultaneously for one event in the kitchen affecting circuit 7. A short circuit that would involve a live wire shorting to ground or arcing to ground. It would have to involve ground or some metallic path to ground in order for the RCCB circuit breaker to trip simultaneously with the circuit breaker for circuit 7. So that's option 1. You could have one event affecting circuit 7. Those are the sockets in the kitchen and devices connected to those sockets that tripped both breakers at the same time.
Thank you. So, and then compare and contrast sequence 2. Could you talk us through the hypothesis there?
A second option is you would first have, and I'm going to say first would be a short circuit in circuit 7 that did not involve ground and involved a live wire arcing to the neutral wire, not to a ground path. So that would not trip the RCCB that's only looking at ground.
Now,
so that would,
sorry, Dr. Glover, I interrupted you.
So that would be the first event. You could have a short circuit, again, in the kitchen, circuit 7, affecting the sockets in the kitchen that did not involve ground, that would cause the circuit 7 MCB to trip. But then how does the second breaker, the RCCB, trip? That would be a later event. Now circuit 7 is de-energized. The RCCB is looking at two circuits, circuit 7 and circuit 8. So circuit 7 is now de-energized, so the second event would happen in circuit 8. Circuit 8 are the flat sockets, the sockets in the remaining portion of the flat not involving the kitchen. So that would be the second one, and I do say that that RCCB would have to have occurred after circuit 7 trips. It could not happen before.
And it's flowing from that point. Of these two hypotheses, which one do you consider to be more likely?
Well, at this point, I'd have to fast forward to other evidence that I've looked at. It's more likely now that I've looked at all of the evidence that there were two separate events, that circuit 7 tripped first for a line to neutral fault affecting that circuit or some device connected to circuit 7 in the kitchen. And then the second event occurred at a later time. That's my opinion now. At this point in the report, I just leave the two options. There are two possibilities.
So cutting to the chase, you consider sequence 2 to be more likely?
I do, yes.
Okay. Now, having regard to the evidence, in the final paragraph of page 11 of your report, so staying on that page, you say this: based on the above analysis of the timing and sequencing of the two circuit breakers that tripped, it is probable that the fire origin is 1, within the area of fire origin, and 2, at the electrical component that caused the circuit breaker for circuit number 7 to trip. Now, first of all, does that remain your view?
It does, yes.
Putting it somewhat differently, to what extent does identifying the circuit breakers which did not trip provide useful evidence in ruling out certain appliances in relation to origin?
Okay, could you repeat that?
Of course. Now, looking at the alternative analysis, to what extent does looking at the circuit breakers which did not trip help you in identifying origin?
Well, that would be looking at the circuit breakers that did not trip. It would be very helpful to rule out items as a probable fire origin. Just to give you an example, there's a cooker in the kitchen. The cooker is adjacent to the fridge freezer. We may look at that later. And that cooker was supplied by a dedicated circuit, actually circuit number 1. So the cooker in the kitchen was not supplied by circuit 7. So that would allow me, just from that, along with many other things, pieces of evidence, to rule out the cooker as a probable fire origin. And then you could go on to other devices that were not connected to circuit 7 that could also be ruled out.
Dr. Glover, that's useful. We will come on to the individual appliances, and as you say, that point becomes more vividly illustrated there. Now, before we leave the issue of the consumer unit and circuit breakers, one point's arisen in relation to which it would be very useful to have your help and guidance, and that's understanding the role of circuit breakers in the prevention of an electrical fire. Now, first of all, can you help us with the most basic question? What's the purpose of a circuit breaker?
It is a safety device.
And be more specific about it. Is the aim to prevent, I think, what you've described elsewhere as a violent event, or alternatively, is it to cut the violent event, or is it both?
It is both. It would be optimistic, or you would hope that a circuit breaker would trip when there is an abnormal electrical event, a short circuit or an overload, and you would hope that it would trip before a fire occurs, but that's not always the case.
One question that's arisen that your views would be sought on is whether, is there a reason why the circuit breakers were not able to prevent the fire starting in the first place?
Circuit breakers take time. They have to detect the short circuit, and then after they detect the short circuit, it takes time for them to open their contacts to de-energize the circuit. So there is a time delay involved. And again, if the short circuit is not too violent or it doesn't immediately ignite combustibles in the area of the short circuit, then the circuit breaker is successful in de-energizing the circuit before a fire. However, it's possible that if you have combustibles in proximity to the short circuit, to the arcing, that those would ignite very quickly before the circuit breaker or a fuse has an opportunity to de-energize the circuit.
Now, I don't know whether you're able to express a view on this, given what you've seen, but are you able to help us to whether you think the circuit breaker operated sufficiently quickly here, or insufficiently quickly?
I didn't notice any defects in the circuit breaker. It did its job, but circuit breakers are not perfect. They can't predict a fire. They have to wait until the short circuit occurs, until the arcing occurs, until there's enough overcurrent sufficient to trip the breaker.
Do you have any cause to believe there was any fault or defect of any sort in the consumer box, the consumer unit rather?
No, I have no reason to see any defects in the consumer unit.
Thank you. Dr. Glover, I now want to turn on to the analysis you conducted of the various electrical appliances and other electrical items. And the first electrical appliance I'd be grateful for your help in relation to is the kitchen extractor fan. And for that purpose, first of all, it'd probably be useful if, Paul, you could draw up section 11.7 of Dr. Glover's report. Now, first of all, Dr. Glover, that sets out the summary of your views in relation to the examination of the extractor fan. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, can you confirm whether the extractor fan formed part of circuit 7 or not?
Yes, the extractor fan, it's located in the window on the east side of the kitchen, and the wires that supply the extractor fan come from circuit 7. There's a spur that taps off of a socket behind the fridge freezer that supplies power to the extractor fan.
Thank you. And am I right in understanding you examined 5 exhibits originally forming part of that fan for the purposes of your report?
5 exhibits. This is all related to the extractor fan?
All related to the extractor fan. Can you remember now?
I'd have to count them.
Don't worry. But you certainly examined components and wiring relating to the extractor fan.
I examined all the exhibits that were associated with the extractor fan, and they were in different categories. The fan motor, for example, is MJS6. There was debris found in the window of below the extractor fan. Various other items were collected, and I examined all of them.
That's useful. And if we look at 11.7 itself, you say this: the following observation supports a fire origin at extractor fan in flat 16. 1, most of the components are missing from the control board, including a rectangular shaped capacitor from the power supply section of the control board. Can you help us? Why does that support a fire origin at the extractor fan? To the lay reader, it looks neutral at best.
Sometimes when you have a fire that initiates on a control board, a printed circuit board, you will see components missing, and you will also see perhaps non-uniform fire damage. One section of that control board, that printed circuit board, would be more heavily fire damaged than another section. And so that's the type of things you look for. Missing components. If you have missing components, you have no way to evaluate them for abnormal electrical activity. For example, you have a capacitor where there's been an internal short circuit within the capacitor, and it's been a catastrophic failure that punctures the enclosure of the capacitor. You would only be able to determine that if you had the capacitor to examine. So when you have missing components, or if you have non-uniform fire damage, that would be a possibility of a fire origin there.
Understood. Now, you then go on to say, conversely, the following observations do not support a fire origin at either the extractor fan or the wiring and switches from the spur to the extractor fan. 1, no arc damage or abnormal electrical activity is observed on any of the following exhibits related to the extractor fan, and you referred earlier on to MJS 6 in particular. 2, the short circuit overload that caused the circuit breaker for circuit number 7, kitchen in flat 16, to trip on the night of the fire did not occur in the extractor fan or any wire or electrical electronic component downstream of the isolator switch. If it had, the 3 amp fuse in the isolator switch would have blown more quickly than the circuit breaker, which did not occur. And does that remain your view there?
Yes, that's a long sentence, but that was actually a key component of my analysis for the extractor fan. The extractor fan is protected by a fuse that's located below the extractor fan. The extractor fan itself is in the window, but the wires run through an isolator switch, and within that isolator switch that feeds the extractor fan, there is a 3 ampere fuse. And earlier on in my report, I discuss the timing of fuses versus circuit breakers, and I show that the 3 amp fuse will always blow more quickly than the 32 amp circuit breaker for circuit 7. So this is why one of the main reasons I ruled out the extractor fan is because that 3 ampere fuse, which always would have tripped first, which would have blown first before the 32 amp circuit breaker for circuit 7, was not blown. And so that was a key element of my analysis for the extractor fan. That's
clear, thank you. And looking at subparagraph 3, you say the arc damage exhibits MJS1 and JDG1 are not associated with the extractor fan from flat 16 or any of the wiring associated with that extractor fan. And again, you were able to say that because you'd examined, first of all, the number of strands within the wires that form part of MJS1 and JDG1, and they weren't the type of wiring you'd find, or you did find, in relation to the extractor fan.
Yeah, so we looked, by the way, at an exemplar extractor fan from flat 13. The fire was in flat 16, but one of the items of exhibits that I looked at was an exemplar fan from flat 13, and then we looked at the remains of the extractor fan from flat 16. We looked at all the wires in both of those exhibits. We counted the strands, and I found, as well as my other investigators, no wires associated with the extractor fan that had 24 strands. Remember those 2 arc damage exhibits, MJS1 and JDG1, both have 24 strands. Those were not associated with the extractor fan.
Thank you. And then the final point you set out at subparagraph 4, and then you set out the basic point that Nuaire, the manufacturer of the fan, had received no report confirming that a cuff fan, C-fan to C was the source of a fire. And that's your final observation there, the absence of previous instances of fire.
Correct. As you see, Nuaire is the company that manufactures the extractor fan. You say CYFAN, C-Y-F-A-N. And they had sold some 113,000 of them since, I believe, 2013, none of which, there were no reported fires for any of those fans.
And just to help us, what weight do you attach to the absence of previous incidents generally compared to the specific analyses set out in subparagraphs 1 to 3? Can you help us?
It's just another key element. I think when you look at the possibility of a component having failed, it's important to look at the history of failures of the component, the history of any fires, the history of any recalls, the history of any legal suits, to see if there had been any prior incidents. So that is a component I don't know if I'd attach more weight to that than the actual evidence that I did look at.
It's simply a relevant factor. Is that
It
fair?
is relevant, yes.
So it's 11 o'clock. We've been going for an
It is,
hour.
yes.
Would that be a convenient place for a brief break?
It's convenient to you, I take it.
It is, yes, thank you.
Yes. Well, Dr. Glover, we have a short break, roughly once an hour, so we're going to take one now. I have to ask you not to talk about your evidence while you're out of the room, if you don't mind. We'll come back at 11:10, and if you go with the usher, she'll look after you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, you go now. Right, 11:10, please. Thank you. Right, Dr. Glover, ready to carry on?
Thank you.
Yes,
sir.
good. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Dr. Glover, welcome back. We were covering in this particular part of the examination analysis of the electrical appliances and relevant electrical items in the kitchen. The next one I want to talk to is the cooker, which I think you were adverting to earlier on in the evidence. First question, to be clear, the cooker was serviced by circuit 7, is that right?
The cooker was served by circuit 1, not circuit 7.
Apologies, circuit
1.
And if we could just identify where the cooker was, Paul, if you could bring up figure 2 at JDGR, 0000001 underscore 0008. And just so that we can orientate ourselves, that is a sketch plan produced by Mr. Gabady upon which you relied, is that right?
Yes, this is Mr. Gabady's figure, yes.
And if we look at the top left-hand side, we see mop and bucket, then A, which is the large fridge freezer, and then next to it is B, which is partially obscured by the 4 rings.
Correct.
And the B there is the cooker.
It is.
Thank you. And as you said correctly, it's served by circuit 1.
Yes.
And if we remove that, and actually, Paul, if I could ask you to go to section 5.5 of Dr. Glover's report, which is at page 23 of that report. And if you could amplify 5.5, here you set out a summary of your observations. The following observations do not support a fire origin at the cooker of circuit number 1, cooker in flat 16. 1. The cooker is supplied by circuit number 1 at the consumer unit in flat 16. The circuit breaker for circuit number 1 was found in the on position, confirming that there was no short circuit or overcurrent sufficient to trip the 32 amp breaker for the cooker circuit. 2. The circuit breakers that did trip at the time of the fire, the circuit breaker for circuit number 7 kitchen and the RCB circuit breaker for the RCD protected circuits, are unrelated to the cooker circuit. 3. Arc damage exhibits MJS1 and JDG1 are not associated with the cooker circuit wiring. Now, they're the first 3. Are those the principal observations upon which you rely, first of all?
Well, those are the first 3 or 4 of 8 observations.
Yeah, what I was trying to, are those the principal ones? I know there are others that follow, but those are the primary matters you rely upon.
I would point to 6, the possibility of this might have been someone was cooking on top of the cooktop, and that a fire could have started from non-electrical means by cooking oil or something. But I did examine the switches for the 4 hobs on the cooktop and found that those were all in the off position, verifying that, in my opinion, there was no cooking going on the night of the fire. There were also no cooking pans found on top of the cooktop.
Thank you. And looking at 8, you say there was only superficial heat, fire damage to the front, sides and rear of the cooker. To the lay reader, that looks like an important feature. Is that a fair observation to make?
Yes, it is. There's very little, there's no arc damage to the wires that supply the cooker, located behind the cooker. And you look at the sides and the front of the cooker, they're fire damaged only. There's also no foodstuffs found in the cooker. There was in the oven, for example.
Would you expect foodstuffs to have survived a fire? Would you have expected foodstuffs to have survived the fire?
In the oven, possibly, yes.
Thank you. Now turning to a new and separate appliance, that's the Breadmaker, the MTAD, and you deal with this at section 10 of your report, which is at pages 37 to 39. And Paul, could I ask you to turn to page 39 in particular? Now, just to get some context, Dr. Glover, first of all, the Breadmaker was found on the kitchen floor next to the large fridge freezer, is that right?
Yes.
And that you set out your conclusions here at paragraph 10.3, and the following observations do not support a fire origin at the Breadmaker in flat 16. And first of all, Mr. Gabady states that the Breadmaker was not plugged in. Ms. Afewerki states that she never used the Breadmaker and never saw it used. 2, there is no evidence that the Breadmaker had been plugged into any socket at the time of the fire. And 3, there is no evidence of arc damage or other abnormal electrical activity to the Breadmaker power supply cord, main supply flex, internal wiring or heating coil. 4, exhibits MGS1 and JDG1 are not consistent with the Breadmaker power supply cord and wiring. Fifthly, the 3 wires of the Breadmaker power supply cord remain flexible. They're not brittle, not friable. Now, stopping there, can you help us? It's probably a question that goes to the obvious, but why is the absence of brittle or friable material a useful consideration or a relevant consideration to have regard to here?
Yes, well, I tried to imagine this scenario where this Breadmaker would have been plugged in, and since its location is adjacent to the fridge freezer, the likely socket, if it had been plugged in, would have been a socket behind the fridge freezer. That would be the closest to where the Breadmaker was found on the day of the fire. Now, when you look at the other wires that were found behind the fridge freezer, those were quite friable, quite brittle, segments of wires that had been broken off as a result of fire heat, not arc damage, but fire heat. I did not see that for the Breadmaker. The power supply cord, the main supply flex, was intact, including the plug and the fuse. And as I said, the 3 wires were not brittle. So I would not have, I would conclude that this Breadmaker was not plugged in behind the fridge freezer.
Thank you. And the view set out there at fine, I should say, the sake of completeness, you've got 6. The fuse and the plug for the Breadmaker power supply cord is intact, not blown.
Correct.
And does that remain your view as set out in section 10.3 of your report?
It does.
Next, can we deal with the small fridge? And first of all, could I ask Paul to bring up the sketch, page 8 of your report? Thank you. And if that could be amplified again, Paul. And I think the position of the small fridge is identified with the capital letter I in the bottom left-hand corner. Is that right?
Yes, and I would emphasize that this sketch was drawn by Mr. Kabidi. This was his memory of where these various items were located within the kitchen prior to the fire.
And that's what you've relied upon, as
Yes.
you indicated earlier.
Yes.
Now, if, Paul, we could de-amplify and go to page 30 internally. And Dr. Glover, section 7.3, you set out again your summary in relation to the observations you make concerning the small fridge. And you say the following observations do not support a fire origin at the small fridge or its power supply cord in flat 16. 1, Mr. Kabedi and Ms. Afewerki both state that the small fridge was not in use and not plugged in. 2, post-fire examination of exhibit MJD 33, the 4-gang extension lead that could have been used for the small fridge, showed that it had no plugs inserted into any of its 4 sockets. 3, there is no evidence that the small fridge had been plugged into any socket at the time of the fire. 4, there is no arc damage to the small fridge's power supply cord or to any internal wire or component within the small fridge. 5, the fuse and the plug associated with the power supply cord is intact, not blown. 6, there were no foodstuffs found in the small fridge. 7, the underside of the small fridge is largely intact, undamaged, including one of the plastic feet. And does that remain your view?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Could we now turn to the medium-sized freezer? And Paul, apologies for jumping around. Could we go back to page 8 internally to this report? If we could amplify Mr. Kabedi's sketch plan. And the medium-sized freezer is, I think, identified by the capital letter H in the bottom left-hand corner. Is that right?
Yes, the H is the medium freezer, and the small fridge that we just talked about is I, which would have been on top of the medium freezer.
And just to confirm evidence you gave earlier on, I think I'm right in understanding that you accept that the stranding found in relation to the arc damage exhibits MGS1 and JDG1 is consistent both in strand count and diameter with the medium-sized freezer's power cord.
Yes, as well as a couple other internal wires that had 24 strands.
Thank you. Paul, if we could de-amplify Mr. Kabedi's sketch plan, and could I ask you to turn to page 33 internally? Thank you. And Dr. Glover, there we find the summary of your conclusions in relation to the medium-sized freezer. First of all, the following observations support a fire origin at the medium-sized freezer or its power supply cord in flat 16. 1, exhibit JDG1, which I found inside the medium-sized freezer during my 27th of April 2018 examination at Bureau Veritas, consists of stranded copper wire segments with arc-damaged copper beads at one end. Each wire segment for JDG1 has 24 strands with an approximate strand diameter of 0.16 millimeters. 2, the medium-sized freezer's power supply cord, as well as other cords within the medium-sized freezer, include wires with 24 strands and approximate strand diameter of 0.16 to 0.18 millimeters. This stranding is consistent with arc damage exhibits JDG1 and MJS1. And then you set out factors which do not support a fire origin at the medium-sized freezer. 1, Mr. Kabadi and Ms. Afwerki both state that the medium-sized freezer was not in use and not plugged in at the time of the fire. And Paul, you can turn over the page. And you note the support provided by the Bureau Veritas report. 2, in his witness statement, Mr. Kabadi states the medium-sized freezer stopped working about 9 years ago, so it was unplugged. He had not bought it long before it stopped working, so called in a fridge technician from the Yellow Pages who told him the fuse had gone. Post-fire examination of MGD 33, the extension lead that could have been used for the medium-sized freezer showed that it had no plugs inserted into any of its 4 sockets. There was no evidence that medium-sized freezer had been plugged into any socket at the time of the fire. 5, there were no traces of foodstuffs found in the medium-sized freezer. 6, other than exhibit JDG1, there is no arc damage to any component or any other internal wire within the medium-sized freezer. Either JDG1 arced at a prior time unrelated to the fire, or it was relocated into the medium-sized freezer during or after firefighting efforts. 7, there is no arc damage to the remains of the medium-sized freezer's power supply cord. 8, the medium-sized freezer's plug was initially found attached to the power supply cord, but later became separated from the cord. 9, in my opinion, MJD 34, the remnants of a plug, is the medium freezer plug that became separated. 10, the fuse in MJD 34 is intact, not blown. And finally, a paper label on the compressor and the plastic enclosure of an electrical junction box, both located within the medium-sized freezer, remain largely intact. It is implausible that the fire origin could be within the medium-sized freezer with a paper label and a plastic junction box enclosure largely intact. And then you go on in the final paragraph. In my opinion, observations 1 to 11 above strongly support a conclusion that the medium-sized freezer was not plugged in at the time of the fire. As such, it is probable that arcing to JDG1 occurred either 1, during the initiation or early stages of the fire when it was located in the area of fire origin, electrically connected to circuit number 7 kitchen, or 2, at a prior time unrelated to the fire. And Mr. Kabadi reported the freezer stopped working 9 years ago and a bad fuse was found. Does that remain your view?
Yes, I have further concluded, if you go to my addendum later, that in my opinion that the JDG1 arced at a prior time unrelated to the fire.
We'll come on to that, but yes. Essentially your view remained the same in terms of excluding
yes.
freezing. Thank you. Penultimate appliance or wiring that I'd like to take you to, the extension lead. This is dealt with at section 6 of your report. And first of all, before we go to the summary at page 27, could I ask Paul to go to figures A4-8? There we go. First of all, this is the extension lead with which you're concerned in section 6 of your report, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Can you help us as to where the extension lead was found? Can you remember?
Yes, the extension lead was found, and there are some photos in there that I could refer to, just A4, 1, and 2 perhaps, but it was found between on the east side of the kitchen, very close to the living room. Okay, there were wooden panel sliding doors that separated the kitchen from the living room. Those panel doors were consumed during the fire, but this extension lead was found by fire investigators on the day of the fire, right in that vicinity where the wooden panel doors separated the living room from the kitchen on the east side.
Thank you, Dr. Glover. Now, Paul, if we could put down these photographs and return to Dr. Glover's report and page 27 within that report. And Dr. Glover, there you set out the observations that led you to conclude that they don't support fire origin at the extension lead or its power supply cord. One, no plug was found in any of the 4 sockets of the extension lead. If there were no devices plugged into the extension lead at the time of the fire, the extension lead delivered 0 load current with no heat dissipation due to load current. Further, with no connected devices, the extension lead would not have delivered any short circuit current or any overcurrent to such a device. 2, there is no arc damage to the internal current carrying components of the extension lead, and there is no arc damage to the remains of the power supply cord for the extension lead. 3, arc damaged exhibits MGS1, JDG1 are not associated with extension lead power supply cord, main supply flex. 4, there is a missing portion of the power supply cord and a missing plug for the extension lead. Therefore, it is unknown whether the extension lead was plugged into an electrical socket at the time of the fire. 5, if at the time of the fire the extension lead had been plugged into a socket, the most likely socket would have been the one on the living room east wall, approximately 18 inches from the sliding door panels that separated the kitchen from the living room. And as we've just looked at, shown in figure A4-3, taken on the 14th of June, the severed end of the extension lead power supply cord is near that living room socket. 6, the living room socket is supplied by circuit number 8, flat sockets, not circuit 7. If at the time of the fire the extension lead had been plugged into that living room socket, then it is unrelated to the one event or the first of 2 events that caused the circuit breaker for circuit number 7 kitchen to trip. 7, if at the time of the fire the extension lead had been plugged into that living room socket, the missing portion of the power supply cord and missing plug would then have been located in the living room, which is outside the area of fire origin as established by fire investigators. Finally, in my opinion, it is implausible that a fire could begin in the living room where Mr. Kabedi was sleeping at the time, then progress through the sliding door panels into the kitchen and not awaken him until the kitchen smoke detector alarmed. Dr. Glover, does that remain your view?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, the final element of wiring that I'd like to discuss with you before we get on to the large fridge freezer is the fluorescent light and wiring from the ceiling of the kitchen. Now, you deal with this in section 13 of your report. That's at pages 63 to 64. Now, I think it's right to say that you've examined 4 exhibits comprising the wiring from the ceiling above the kitchen counter and near the window, as well as a fluorescent light. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. And if, Paul, I might ask you to turn to page 64 and section 13.5. Again, if you would amplify that, Paul, please. You there set out again the summary of your observations, and the following observations do not support a fire origin at any of the following items in the ceiling of the kitchen in flat 16. 1, lighting was supplied by circuits numbers 2 and 3 at the consumer unit. Excuse me. Both of the circuit breakers for circuit numbers 2 and 3 were found in the on positions, confirming that there was no short circuit or overcurrent sufficient to trip either of the 6 amp breakers for these lighting circuits. 2, the circuit breakers that did trip at the time of the fire, the circuit breaker for circuit number 7 kitchen, the RCCB circuit breaker for the RCD protected circuits, are unrelated to the lighting circuits in these exhibits. 3, no arc damage or other abnormal electrical activity is observed for any of the wiring in the exhibits identified there. 4, arc damage exhibits MGS1 and JDG1 are not associated with any of the wiring for exhibits MJD 49, 63 or 64. Does that remain your view?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Glover, I'd like to turn to the question of the large fridge freezer, which is considered at section 12 of your report. And just so that we can orientate ourselves as to what you looked at, is it right to say that you examined the remains of the large fridge freezer, which is a Hotpoint FF175BP, which you understood to be manufactured in or about October 2008?
October 2008, yes.
Now, is it right that you also examined what's been described as an exemplar?
Yes, I did.
And that exemplar was provided by Whirlpool, and it was an index number, or rather model number FF175BP, but manufactured in or about November 2006. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, can you help us? What differences were there between the large fridge freezer that was in flat 16 and the exemplar fridge that you also examined?
Now, there were a number of differences. For example, within the fridge freezer is a device called a motor run capacitor, a capacitor.
If I could stop you there, again asking a basic question, what's the motor run capacitor?
A capacitor is an electrical device that stores charge, and it is utilized in this case to help the refrigerator run more efficiently.
Thank you. Apologies, I interrupted you when you were in full flow, but
No.
you're identifying the differences between the exemplar and the large fridge freezer, and you referred to the motor run capacitor.
So as I, in my understanding, reviewing the records and the documents that Whirlpool changed their capacitor from a so-called P0 capacitor to a P2, P as in Peter. A P0 capacitor is one that is not protected against fire or against electrical shock. So for the earlier model, the exemplar that I looked at, which was manufactured in 2006, that had the unprotected motor run capacitor, the so-called P0 capacitor. The subject fridge freezer that was in flat 16 was manufactured in October 2008, and according to the Whirlpool documents, by that time Whirlpool had switched over to a so-called P2 capacitor that is protected against fire. It's designed and manufactured so that if there is a problem within the motor run capacitor, it will be a fail-safe device, whether it be it failing from a fire or from an electric shock point of view. So that's one example.
And is this difference material to your analysis of origin and cause? So is the difference between the exemplar and the subject large fridge freezer, is it relevant, is it material to your analysis of origin?
There was some relevance, but the exemplar fridge freezer that I looked at was very helpful to me in understanding the basic components within the fridge freezer. And then when I went to the subject fridge freezer, I could note, I was well aware of the differences. I've talked about one, the capacitor. There are other differences.
Can you help us what those the other principal differences are that are material?
Yes. Both fridge freezers have a compressor. That is the device that is used to compress the refrigerant. That's part of the refrigeration cycle for the fridge freezer. The compressor is located at the bottom rear of the fridge freezer, either one. The compressor that I looked at for the exemplar was manufactured by a company called Tecumseh, that's Tecumseh. So it was a Tecumseh compressor, whereas the subject fridge freezer from flat 16 had a compressor that was manufactured by Embraco, that would be Embraco. That's a second difference. The control boards were slightly different. The number of wires, there was a wiring harness within the exemplar fridge freezer, and the remains of a wiring harness in the subject fridge freezer. Both of them had 5 wires, but there were some differences. One of them, all 5 wires were in a cord, so to speak, with an outer jacket, whereas in the other, the wires were separate wires. So those were 3 differences.
Okay. And they're the principal material ones you consider?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if I could turn to the conclusions in your report regarding the large fridge freezer, and Paul, could I ask you to turn at page 61 of Dr. Glover's report, and in particular at section 1210. Now, at the top of the page, you say this: exhibits reviewed in this section are segregated into three possible fire origins, one within the fridge freezer, exhibit BPS 1, 2 at the fridge freezer power supply cord, the main supply flex, and 3 components associated with the fixed wiring for circuit number 7, kitchen. Now, if we can start first of all with subsection 12.10.1 within BPS 1, that's the large fridge freezer. You made you found the following observations supported fire origin within BPS 1. One, there's a missing run capacitor, which would have been mounted on the compressor mounting plate to the left of the compressor. Now, stopping there, why does that support a fire origin internal to BPS 1, the large fridge freezer?
Well, whenever you have a missing electrical component, that's of concern. You can't evaluate a missing component. You can't look at the device to see if there was abnormal electrical activity. There had been some prior fires with these fridge freezers that involved run capacitors. However, we do know that the subject fridge freezer had a P2, a fail-safe device in it. But that's always a concern when you have a missing component that is perhaps completely consumed during the fire that you cannot evaluate.
Turning to 2, arc damage exhibits MGS1 and JDG1 are consistent with the remains of 2 wires found within the relay compartment of the fridge freezer. And you give the reason next for that consistency. It's that each of these wires, which has 24 strands, is either a run capacitor wire or an internal jumper wire within the relay compartment. Is that right?
Yes, we looked at the remains of the connectors within the compressor relay compartment. We found 2 connectors that had 24 strand wires in them, and by process of elimination concluded that those connectors served wires for either the missing run capacitor or for an internal wire within the compressor relay compartment.
Thank you. Looking at the third observation you make, arc damaged exhibits MGS1 and JDG1 are also consistent with exhibit SLW 111, a wire segment with a soldered end from BPS 3. Now, taking each element of that, first of all, what's exhibit BPS 3?
BPS 3 are wires that were found below the fridge freezer, basically. Subject to review. That should be BPS 3 on page 50. Conductors from fridge freezer base. That's what BPS 3 is. One of those wires was SLW 111, basically a wire segment that was found to have 24 strands.
Thank you. The fourth point, you mentioned the previous incidents involving a P0 run capacitor and also 2 reports of fire potentially involving a P2 run capacitor, and that's the reason you adverted to earlier on. Now, you then go on to set out observations that don't support fire origin within BPS 1. And at number 1, you say no arc damage was observed within BPS 1. Now, to the lay reader, that looks like a significant factor pointing against the fire origin but within the large fridge freezer. What would be your response to that lay observation?
Yes, and as I mentioned, particularly focus on MJS1. That was found in the second bedroom. We looked at that earlier today, a wire segment approximately 10 centimeters in length with a fuse section. I concluded that MJS1, there's no way that could have arced in the second bedroom on the night of the fire for various reasons. There was a lady sleeping in the room for one reason. Number 2, the bedroom is served by circuit 8, okay?
Which didn't trip.
Circuit 8 didn't trip. Mr. Kabidi turned off the main switch. which is very helpful in my analysis, before he vacated, so that when the fire eventually got into the second bedroom later on after he vacated, there was no energized facilities there, so you couldn't have had arc damage at that time. So for a number of reasons, I concluded that MJS1 could not have arced in the second bedroom. So that means you've got two possibilities. And the one is that it was electrically connected to circuit 7 in the kitchen, because that's the circuit breaker that tripped. Or it arced at some prior time, it's just been there for months or years, sometime unrelated to the fire. Those are your two possibilities.
Moving on to sub-paragraph 2, you say the 3 amp fuse of the fridge freezer power supply cord is intact, not blown. Again, to the lay person looking at this, that seems like a significant factor pointing against the large fridge freezer being the origin. What would be your response to that lay observation?
Yes, and I want to point out that that's 13 ampere fuse, 1.3, not 3 amps. Earlier I had mentioned that there's no way the extractor fan could have been the origin of the fire because the 3 ampere fuse did not blow. The 3 amp fuse that protected the extractor fan. Here for the fridge freezer, we have a 13 ampere fuse. And I describe earlier in my report, I compare the operating times of the 32 amp circuit breaker for circuit 7, compared that with the fuse blowing time for a 13 ampere fuse. And the analysis shows that either one could go first. It's possible that the 32 amp circuit breaker could trip before the 13 amp fuse in a wide range of currents, I believe, ranging from, the numbers are in there, 100 to a few hundred amperes. Either one could go. So the fact that a 13 amp fuse for the fridge freezer is intact, it's not blown, that doesn't mean that there was no short circuit within the fridge freezer, because the 32 amp circuit breaker quite likely could have tripped first, leaving that 13 ampere fuse intact.
Thank you. And finally, just we have subparagraph 3. Whirlpool's reported there were no recalls, no legal proceedings against Whirlpool, Indesit or its representatives involving hotpoint FF175 BP or FF175 BG. Just for the sake of completeness, I note that. Yes. Do the views you set out there at 12.10.1 remain your view?
Yes, sir.
Now, Paul, if we can turn over the page to section 12.10.2, and at this point you go through the various observations you identified in relation to the fridge freezer power supply cord. And I won't read them out, but essentially your conclusion is that the evidence does not support a fire origin within the power supply cord for the reasons you set out in subparagraphs 1 and 2. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And that remains your view?
It does.
And similarly, if we go on to subsection 12.10.3, which deals with fixed wiring for circuit number 7, the kitchen, you say this: the following observations do not support a fire origin at the fixed wiring for circuit number 7 kitchen in flat 16. 1. No arc damage or abnormal electrical activity is observed on any of the following items related to the fixed wiring. A. Remains of a double socket buzz bar with 2 receivers from MCL 06. Again, for those of us less technically minded, what's a buzz bar?
A bus bar is within a socket. If you remove the enclosure of a socket, you will see a metal devices. They're basically current-carrying devices that carry the current from the consumer unit through the socket to the plug that it is plugged into.
Thank you. B. Remains of a single socket buzz bar and double socket buzz bar from BPS 5. And 3. Wires on kitchen ring main side of spur. 2. Arc damaged exhibits MGS1 and JDG1 are not consistent with the kitchen ring main wires, circuit number 7, each of which has 7 strands wire. And thirdly and finally, the fixed wiring is protected from mechanical damage via wire trunking and socket switch spur enclosures. Just looking at the third and final one, is that to say that you found no damage to the fixed wiring? Is that what subparagraph 3 is getting at?
no arc damage to the fixed wiring. There's certainly fire damage. The insulation is burned off, but there's no arc damage or evidence of abnormal electrical activity.
That's useful. Thank you very much. Now, if I could ask you, and Paul, would you mind turning to page 77 of your report? And this sets out your essential conclusions in relation to the large fridge freezer. And at 16.1, under the heading Relationship between Fire Origin and Circuit Number 7 Kitchen, you say this: within the area of fire origin, it is probable that the fire origin is at the electrical component that caused the circuit breaker for Circuit Number 7 Kitchen to trip. And you refer back to section 15.1, which we don't need to go to because it effectively replicates what we've just looked at section 12.10. But then turning to subsection 16.2, under the heading Devices in area of fire origin confirmed to be electrically connected to Circuit Number 7 Kitchen, you rehearse the analysis we've just undergone, and then by a process effectively of elimination, you conclude that the large fridge freezer is implicated or probably implicated in the origin of the fire. Is that a fair, if general, summary?
Yes, I concluded that the internal large fridge freezer was the most probable fire origin.
And following on from the use of the word probability, could I ask you to turn to page 77 of your report, and you'll see in the preamble to section 16, the third line, you use the phrase a reasonable degree of engineering certainty. Can you help us? What does that phrase mean? Are you indicating there that you've applied the balance of probabilities or some other standard?
Now, when I say reasonable degree of engineering certainty, nothing is 100% certain, okay? But based on all my training and education and experience investigating electrical fires, my conclusions are to a reasonable degree of engineering certainty. Most probable.
Most probable. Now, if I could turn to the addendum you prepared, and just by way of context, on the 16th of November of this year, you provided an addendum to your report, which reviewed a CT scan of exhibit JDG6B, that's B for Bravo, a wire connector recovered from the compressor relay compartment of the large fridge freezer. Am I right thus far?
Yes, sir.
Now, in short, your conclusion is that the wire connector had a poor crimp, which led to an overheated connection, which you posit as a hypothetical fire initiation scenario. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Now, in relation to the addendum, Dr. Glover, my questions will fall essentially into three parts. First of all, just dealing with basic factual matters relating to Exhibit 6B for Bravo. Secondly, some contextual points in relation to that exhibit. And finally, some specific questions relating to the analysis set out in the addendum. So starting first of all with the first part, and that's the basic factual matters. Paul, could I ask you to turn up the addendum, which is at JDGR quadruple 0019 underscore 0001, and that's the addendum, is that right, Dr. Glover?
Yes.
And if I could ask Paul to turn to page 5, and if you could amplify figure 1. The exhibit with which we're concerned is 6B for Bravo, which is more precisely identified on the right-hand side. Is that right?
Yes.
And then we see it together with other exhibits on the left-hand side, and it's at the bottom left-hand corner of that photo.
Yes.
Can you just help us? The other exhibits on the left-hand side, they are extracted from the large fridge freezer as well, is that right?
Yes, all of these exhibits marked JDG6 were collected from within the compressor relay compartment that was attached to the compressor for the fridge freezer in flat 16.
Can you help us from where, are you able to give us a precise idea of from where within the large fridge freezer exhibit 6B for Bravo was found, recovered?
So at the rear of the fridge freezer, at the rear bottom, there is a compressor. And attached to that compressor is a small compartment that would have been, had a plastic enclosure for it. And that compartment is called the compressor relay compartment. Within that compartment, the fire investigators recovered JDG6.
Okay. Now, you outlined for us earlier on what the compressor was. It compressed refrigerant, is that right?
Excuse me?
You defined earlier on what the compressor is, and I think you said it compressed the refrigerant. Is that correct?
The compressor compresses the refrigerant that provides the cooling.
Yes.
Yes. Was that your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Secondly, the relay compartment, just so people understand at the outset, what is the relay compartment and what does it do?
Okay, that would be a small explanation. The relay compartment is attached to the compressor, and basically the wires, the electrical wires that provide electricity to the compressor motor, run through this relay compartment. Within that compartment are therefore wires. You're seeing some of the remains in JDG6 here, wire connectors. There are also two, what we call relays. Those are switching devices that are used to control the operation of the compressor. Spend a little time on that just to be more helpful. The two relays, one of them is a so-called PTC, Peter, Thomas, Charlie relay, and that relay is used to start the compressor motor, so that when the compressor is first turned on, when the control board within the refrigerator decides that it's time to provide some cooling, the electrical current flows through this PTC relay to a start winding within the motor that gets the compressor motor started. Then as the motor comes up to speed, the compressor motor comes up to speed and draws the full load current, this PTC relay switches the current over to a second relay, which is an overload relay. So there are two relays within the compressor relay compartment. The second one is an overload relay, has a trade name Clixon, that's Klixon. You're going to find Clixon relays in thousands of refrigerators and other appliances throughout the world. So once the motor is up to speed, the electricity will flow through the overload relay, the Clixon overload relay, and if there is any short circuit or electrical problem within the compressor motor, that Clixon relay will disconnect power and safely remove any overload current. So what you're talking about is wires, wire connectors, and two relays or switching devices in this compressor relay compartment that is affixed to the compressor itself.
That's useful. We'll be coming on, that's useful context. We'll be coming on to the particular operation of these wires and the various components when we come to look at figure 7.
Okay.
But dealing with basic matters at this stage, am I right in understanding that Exhibit 6B for Bravo was a wire connector?
And not only a wire connector, but a small section of wire, actually two wires that are affixed, that are connected to that connector.
And what purpose does that serve?
Okay, those two wires are part of the wiring harness that comes from the internal part of the refrigerator up where the control board is higher up in the refrigerator, but the wiring harness comes down. There are 5 wires. 2 of them are associated with JDG6B as in Bravo, that what we're focusing on here.
Thank you.
And those would be live wires when the compressor calls for power, when it's time to energize the compressor. That JDG6B would be energized wires.
That's useful. Thank you. Now, looking at its composition, as you've adverted to, 6B consists of 2 wires. and each with a strand diameter of 0.17 millimeters. Is that right?
Yes.
But one consisting of 23 strands and another of 14 strands. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Now move to the second part of my questioning in relation to the addendum, and that's really in respect of certain contextual points. Now, looking at how you've set out the reasoning in the addendum, a central element of the hypothesis you advance is the poor crimp connection. Is that a fair summary before we proceed any further?
Yes.
Now, it may be useful if we go to page 6 of the addendum. And can you help us, first of all, with what figure 2 shows?
Yes, could you blow that up a bit?
Paul, could you amplify it? Thank you.
So this is a result of a CT scan that was performed at Nikon Tring at their computer tomography facilities up in the Tring area. We did that in last September 2018, and this is the resulting CT scan of that connector, JDG6B as in Bravo. The top part of that is actually the connector.
If you could return to your former role as a professor and identify in the photograph where that connector is.
So you can see 2 wires that are entering the connector. And this area of the connector is called the wire barrel.
And that is, for the stenographer's purposes, it is the 2 barrels which are alongside each other in the middle of that scan.
Correct. And this is where the connector is crimped. It's a pressure connection, a tool or a machine that provides a compression force to that wire barrel that basically grips the wire strands and keeps them inside of the barrel.
And if I can stop you there, the essential purpose of a crimp connection is to keep the wires within the barrel. Is that it?
Tightly affixed within the barrel, yes.
And it has to be tight within the barrel. Apologies, this question is obvious. Why do the wires have to be kept tight within the barrel?
Because you could have a problem. If they're loose within the barrel, you could get some overheating, which I have concluded happened for this JDG6.
But we can come on to that.
Yeah.
Now, what we have set in the bottom half of this figure is what you've described as cross-sectional slices. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, there are 5 identified there. Is that right?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are cross sections taken by the computer tomography, the CT scan that I observed.
Thank you. And how many cross-sectional slices did you examine in total?
Okay, so the CT scan, starting from the left end of the barrel to the right end of the barrel, goes at approximately 0.03 millimeter intervals. And if you count them up from the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the barrel, there are approximately 80 slices, five of which I am showing here.
To what extent are the 5 slices set out there exemplars of the other cross-sectional slices you reviewed?
Well, you would have to look at all 80, which I did, but basically what I found was a lot of void spaces, an indication of a loose crimp that has not been properly crimped when the compression was applied during the application of this wire. I would also mention there is a space up here. If you blow this up, you can probably see it a little better, maybe not in this figure. But there is a space, and it's a tapered space that tapers down to no space on the right side. And that's another indication that the crimp was not nice and tight. It wasn't a good compression crimp.
Doctor, if I could just stop you there. When you said there's a space there, you're referring to a space in between the 2 wire barrels.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Now, if I could go back to the bottom half of this figure 2. Paul, if you could go back to figure 2, please. And you've identified on 4 of the 5 what you've described as voids.
Yes, and there are actually There are even voids here, but it's somewhat blurry. There are actually voids in all 5 of these sections. In fact, I found voids in all 80 cross sections. Some of them much larger than the others. You've got some very serious ones here on the left. Here it appears that by the way, inside of this crimp of the connector are the wire strands, the individual strands.
Now, if I could stop you there, if we could take this stage by stage, reading from left to right, Dr. Glover, looking at the slide on the furthest left-hand side, to the lay eye, there appear to be voids not only between the wires themselves and the wire barrel, but also between the wires themselves. Is that a correct observation?
Yes, and it's an important one too, because you need the wire strands to be in contact with each other so as to provide an easy way for the current to flow among all of the strands and to reduce the so-called resistance of this contact here. And resistance, if it's too high, can lead to overheating.
Now, stopping there, if we just examine each of these slices, the second slice from the left to the lay eye appears to show voids as between wires. Is that correct?
Yes, it's somewhat blurry, but there are definitely voids between the wire strands. Another feature here, you see the 2 ends of the barrel are not projecting down into the wires strands. Another indication that we have a loose crimp, a loose compression force here.
Okay. And is the consequence of there being voids as between wires the same as the consequences of there being voids as between wires and the wire barrel itself?
Yes, because the electrical current that's flowing in these wire strands eventually has to get out through the connector. This connector then connects on to a spade connection, which provides current to the compressor motor. So the current is coming from these wire strands down the wire. It has to come through the wire strands and through the contact surface of the barrel of the crimp connector, and then the current will flow through the connection, eventually getting to the motor. So you want a nice tight connection to prevent basically overheating. If you have poor contact, you would get overheating.
Thank you. And Paul, if you can take down figure 2 and then put up figure 3. Now, this is essentially a compare and contrast exercise, Dr. Glover, isn't it? Because what you say, you describe figure 3, quotes, as a good crimp, close quotes. Now, if we again move from left to right, even though you describe this as a good crimp, on the left-hand side, there still appear to be voids, certainly to this lay eye. Are there voids there?
There are actually. If I were to change this, I would say it's a better crimp than 6B Bravo, and we're looking at 6A now. But I actually have some concerns about this crimp also.
Okay, so it's relatively better than figure 2, but it's not a, quotes, good, close quotes, crimp.
That's my opinion, yes.
And the reason why you don't think it's a good one, and it may well be the middle slice, the third from the left, illustrates, I think, the point you want to make, is that there are still voids as between the wires themselves and query between the wires and the wire barrel. Is that a fair observation?
Yes, you can still see void spaces. By the way, these barrel curvature are much better than if you looked up at 6B Bravo. You can see them projecting more into the wire strands, which is especially over here, but you still have some void spaces here that would be of some concern.
Thank you. Dr. Glover, those are the points I'd want to draw out in respect to figures 2 and 3. Could I ask you now to turn to page 7 of the addendum, and in particular the third paragraph on that page, which starts Poor Crimping leads. And I'll just let you refresh your memory and just read that paragraph to yourself, first of all.
Yes.
Now, you say there that there is a decrease in contact area between the wire strands and the connector. Now, is the connector the wire barrels you have annotated in figures 2 and 3?
Excuse me?
You say there that there's a decrease in the contact area between the connector and wire strands.
Yes.
My question is, what is the connector, essentially? Is it what we've just seen in figures 2 and 3?
Yes, JDG 6B is the connector.
Okay. Now, you go on to say in this paragraph that there is, quotes, accompanied by an increase in the associated contact resistance. Now, my first question, just to help us understand the analysis, is can you explain, first of all, what contact resistance is?
Okay. You're talking about an electrical term, resistance. Copper is a very good conductor. It can carry current quite easily. It has what we call low resistance. Other devices are not very good conduction of electricity. For example, air. Air is a poor conductor of electricity, especially dry air. And if you have voids, an electrical current has to pass through those void spaces. That means you have an increase in resistance. It's not as, obviously not as good as the copper itself. So the more voids you have, the higher the resistance. The lower the contact area between the wire strands themselves and between the wire strands and the connector. The more voids you have, the higher the resistance, and that leads to power losses and overheating
And
when you do have high resistance.
And when you say connector power loss, that's what you're just referring to now?
Yes, and there's a formula that I provide there that when you have current flowing through a resistance, electrical current, then there is a formula for the power loss at that connector, which is the square of the current times the contact resistance. So the higher the resistance, the more power loss, and when you have power losses at a connector, you have heat.
Thank you. Now, staying with this paragraph, you say that this phenomenon can cause oxidization of the connector itself, and presumably that oxidization itself increases resistance and has the consequences you've just outlined. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, so when you have voids, you have the possibility of oxides, voids around the strands themselves, and also voids between the wire strands and the crimp. When you have those voids, you have the possibility of oxide buildup. It's an electrochemical reaction, electrolysis, that creates oxides, which provides more resistance, that further increases the contact resistance, leading to additional power loss and higher heat.
And is that a process, I'm assuming it is, given the use of the word build-up, that's a process, a problem which gets worse with time?
Yes.
Now, am I right in understanding that prolonged overheating can lead to the ignition of nearby wire insulations? Is that a fair, if general, summary?
Yes, what you end up with in a loose connector like this is basically a glowing connection. It's hot, it's glowing, current is trying to pass through the voids, and any wire insulation in proximity to that is suspect to igniting the insulation on the wires.
And it's the insulation around the wire, so here it would be the insulation which would have been round Exhibit 6 Bravo, is that right?
The wires that enter the crimp, the connector, have insulation on them. The insulation is stripped off inside the barrel, but outside of the connector you have the insulation on the wires, which is no longer visible here because the fire has burned off all the wire insulations.
Can you help us, apologies, this further level of detail, can you help us what material the insulation to the wire is made of?
It's basically, typically a PVC type of insulating material, electrical insulation.
And what sorts of temperature can PVC withstand?
They have different ratings, but a typical one is 90 degrees C.
Thank you. Now, Apologies, Dr. Glover, are you able to keep on going till 1 o'clock, or would you like a break?
At your pleasure, I can continue.
You've been going for an hour. I just wondered whether you appreciate a break at this juncture.
It's your decision, sir.
Well, should we have?
Can I suggest that if you're comfortable keeping going, we'll keep going and see how we get on. If necessary, we can stop for lunch a bit early.
Yes, thank you, sir.
But if not, we can run to 1 o'clock.
Thanks, sir.
Right? Thank you.
Dr. Glover, thank you for that. Now, if I may now turn to the topic of the short circuit in the fridge freezer, and if I could ask you to turn to page 13 of the addendum, and in particular figure 7, which I referred to earlier on. Now, again, just so that I can orientate myself and those listening at the outset, am I right to describe your new hypothesis thus, that there was a short circuit between an energized internal wire and a neutral wire?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Of course. Is it right to characterize your hypothesis thus, there was a short circuit between an energized internal wire and a neutral wire, and that process is illustrated in figure 7?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Now, apologies, could I ask you to turn back to page 12 of the addendum and the third paragraph on that page, which starts with the words figure 7. If I may invite you just to read that to yourself, first of all.
Okay.
And there you refer to the Clixon overload relay, and that's the Clixon overload relay you referred to earlier on in your evidence when describing the relay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, you also say in this paragraph on page 12 that the result of the short circuit you identify there is that the magnitude of current, quotes, is not limited by the compressor motor or Clixon overload relay. It would therefore be in the order of hundreds of amperes, which, for the reasons you've outlined earlier, would be sufficient to trip the 32 amp circuit breaker for circuit number 7. Now, I think it would be useful just at this juncture to understand again, how does the compressor motor and the Clixon overload relay serve to limit the magnitude of the current under normal operation?
Okay, if we could go to figure 7, I could explain that.
Paul, could we go to page 13? Dr. Glover, before you take us through the process, the stenographer has to valiantly identify for the record that which is visible to all of us. And so if you're able to describe each stage before you take us to it, that would greatly help the stenographer, I think.
Yes, sir. So just to familiarize ourselves, this is the power supply wires, or 2 of them that come from the power supply cord or the main supply flex that supplies power to the refrigerator. The energized wire goes up and connects to the control board, and if there were current going to the compressor, by the way, here's the compressor, it's CO. You can see the flow of electrical current goes up to the control board, and when the control board so chooses, it provides current that comes down through an energized wire, goes through the Clixon overload relay into the compressor motor, and then returns through that motor run capacitor down here. That's the normal path of current. I'm showing a different path for a short circuit. Now, before talking about the short circuit that I'm showing here, let's talk about a short circuit over at the motor capacitor. Suppose the motor run capacitor had a short circuit. Then the current would flow through the Clixon relay, through the compressor, and then through the shorted motor run capacitor wires. However, you've got 2 limiting factors here. The overload relay would sense that and then shut off or switch down, and also the compressor itself is a large resistance that would limit the short circuit current, if you did have a short circuit over in this region, to a very small amount, perhaps a few amperes, that would not be sufficient to melt the wires, okay, or cause an arc problem. It would be limited. Here, however, I'm showing a different short circuit. I'm showing a short circuit on the front end of the compressor relay compartment between an energized wire and a neutral wire. And you can see that this short circuit path bypasses both of the clicks-on relay, the overload relay, as well as the compressor itself and the run capacitor. In that case, what do you have to limit the current? You have the wiring of circuit number 7, small fraction of an ohm. You have the power supply cord for the fridge freezer, again, small fraction of 1 ohm. You have the internal wiring harness, a small fraction of ohm. In fact, the majority of the resistance is in the arc itself within the short circuit, typically about 1 ohm, much larger than all of those other limiting factors, which are small fractions of an ohm. So if you think of 1 ohm, now I have to give you another formula. Current is voltage divided by current. Ohm's law, it's a pretty simple circuit. We're supplying this fridge freezer with 230, 240 volts, the standard voltage in the United Kingdom. And if you think of 240 volts in 1 ohm, Ohm's law would give you 240 amperes, 240 volts divided by 1 ohm. So this path, you're not limited by the compressor, you're not limited by the clicks-on overload relay. You're going to have a large amount of current, and then that's either going to cause the 32 amp circuit breaker for circuit 7 to trip, or the fuse, the 13 ampere fuse, to blow. And as I mentioned earlier, there are many cases where the 32 ampere circuit breaker will operate, will trip before the fuse blows.
It's flowing on from that last answer. You say in the same paragraph on page 12 that the 32 amp circuit breaker would trip, quotes, without a blown 13 ampere fuse and the plug for the fridge freezer main supply flex. Just to sort of deal with it point by point, because these matters are quite technical, can you please explain why you say that you would expect this scenario not to result in a 13 amp fuse in the plug for the fridge freezer to blow?
It's very common when you have 13 ampere fuses for appliances not to blow, simply because the 32 amp circuit breaker operates faster. It's going to be a race. One of them is going to be tripped. One of them is going to operate first, but in many cases, the circuit breaker will trip before the 13 ampere fuse blows. I did explain that in section 1 of my report, but it does bear some analysis.
Okay, thank you. Now, can we now turn to the relationship between the scenario you've posited here and arc damage MJS1? Now, in this short circuit scenario, where would you expect to find the electrical arc damage?
So here is the run capacitor. We saw that the run capacitor in the exemplar fridge, as well as in the subject fridge from flat 16, the run capacitor wires had 24 strands. Okay, and this neutral, and so they run along the neutral here. So when you have an arc here from the energized wire, by the way, that was 23 strands and 14 strands, if you recall JDG6 Bravo, arcing to 24 strand wires. Now, as I mentioned before, MJS1 was not found within the subject fridge freezer. It was found in the bedroom, but these wires that go with the fridge freezer for the run capacitor are consistent with that MJS1.
So just so I understand this, you're postulating that the energized wire shown in your diagram is sufficiently close to the neutral wire in terms of physical proximity for an arc to occur between them?
Yes. No, this is a circuit diagram.
Yeah, of course.
So you see what appears to be a large space, but all of these wires enter the relay compartment in close proximity to each other.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. That dealt with the next questions I was going to ask. So could I ask you to turn to page 13 of the addendum? and it's the only paragraph on that page. Now, here you note that in your view, the short circuit scenario you've outlined on the previous page would not cause the RCCB to trip. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, it is.
And could you take us through just your reasoning for coming to that conclusion?
Okay, once again...
Would it help if we put up figure 7 again for you, Dr. Glover?
That's good. If you could blow figure 7 up, expand it. You see the arc, which is that red short circuit that I've annotated in red. The blue and the red is my artwork. The rest of the diagram is a Whirlpool circuit diagram. So I've annotated a short circuit from an energized wire to a neutral wire. And now I've lost track. What was your question?
It's just really understanding why your reasoning for concluding why in the short circuit scenario it wouldn't cause the RCCB to trip. It's just understanding why.
Thank you so much. So here we have a short circuit from an energized wire to a neutral wire. RCCB circuit breakers do not trip, do not operate for what we call a line, an energized line to neutral short circuit. They only trip when the grounding wire or some metallic path to ground is involved. So if electrical current leaves an energized wire and somehow flows to ground or to a grounded metal plate, then the RCCB would pick that up, it would detect it, and it would trip. But in this case, the RCCB would see current coming in, current coming out, even though it's a very high value, could be a short circuit, it's coming in the energized wire, going out the neutral wire. The RCC sees a balance of 0. It doesn't see a net current flowing to a ground path, and so it does not trip.
Understood. Now, I think I'm right in saying that your view is that the RCCB tripped later, but before Mr. Kabady turned off the main switch. Is that, again, a fair, if general, summary of your view?
Yes.
And that you say it's probable that this was a result of essentially smoke and smoke particles attacking an energized socket. Is that right?
Yes, so circuit 7 is tripped. So all of the sockets in the kitchen and the circuit 7 wiring are now de-energized. But the RCCB is looking at 2 circuits, 7 and 8.
And 8.
Circuit 8 are the other flat sockets. And so if those other flat sockets in circuit 8, if one or more of them were attacked by fire, by smoke particles, then knowing that smoke particles, soot, are all electrically conductive, carbonaceous material. If a socket in circuit 8, which is still energized, before Mr. Kabady turns off that main red switch, is attacked by smoke and smoke particles, then you could have a small current. By the way, the RCCB circuit breaker operates for a very small threshold of current, 30 milliamperes. That would be 0.03 amperes. It doesn't take much for that RCCB circuit to trip. And in my opinion, that smoke, soot and smoke particles quite likely caused a socket in circuit 8 to trip at a later time, before Kabady turns off the red main switch.
Looking at that, Dr. Glover, we've noted and you've noted that smoke and smoke particles are conductive. What is less clear is how precisely smoke particles are likely to have led the current flow to the ground receiver. Could you help us understand that process?
So if you look within a socket, or if you think of when you plug your 3-pronged plug into a socket, one of them is the ground prong. It's it's the single one, and above it are the energized prong, the live wire prong, and the neutral prong. They're all in fairly close proximity, the receivers within the socket, that accept those prongs. Okay, so let's suppose you have a socket that is, nothing's plugged into it. Smoke gets into that socket, the holes for the 3 prongs of the plug, and the smoke deposits bridge the gap between the receiver for the energized portion to the ground. Then you have that ground path that would trip an RCCB.
Now, are you able to give us an idea as to the quantity of smoke or smoke particles that would be necessary to produce this effect?
I don't think I could quantify it for you. All you need are smoke particles, soot, to get into the socket receivers and bridge that small gap distance. I guess I have to go back to the 30 milliamperes. It would have to be enough soot and smoke deposits to cause the conduction of at least 30 milliamperes. But if you want milligrams, I would not be able to quantify that without doing some experiments.
Now, staying with this question of the density of smoke, could I ask you to, Paul, if you mind turning to page 14 of the addendum? It's really the third line of the third paragraph on that page, and it's a point we've adverted to earlier on. You say this: it's probable that smoke and smoke particles having exited the kitchen attacked an energized socket. And then you quote an extract from Miss Kinfu's witness statement. Now, at the bottom of page 14, at footnote 4, you acknowledge that the 2 other occupants of flat 16 didn't necessarily agree with Miss Kinfu's recollection that smoke was in the corridor. Now, can you help us with this point? Why have you placed greater weight on the evidence of Miss Kinfu as opposed to the 2 other former residents of flat 16?
Yes. So when I read Ms. Kinfu's statement, she was very explicit in her perception that there was smoke in the corridor. She was awoken from her bedroom, and she says in her statement that she didn't smell or sense any smoke in the bedroom, but once she exited the bedroom door, opened the bedroom door, and entered the corridor within flat 16, then she sensed smoke. She sensed it in 3 ways. She smelled it. She said she even tasted it, if you read her statement, and she saw it. Okay? And all of this is going on. So you can see I opened the bedroom door and I could smell something different, not normal air. It was different. It was like a burning smell and like a chemical smell, and I could taste it. I could not smell it in my room when the door was closed. I went to the corridor of the flat and saw smoke. The smoke was near to the front door, which is at the other end of the corridor from the kitchen. I could still see the front door. I was shocked, and I can't recall if I could see the other end of the corridor near the kitchen. The lights in the flat were off, but light was coming in through the front door, and everything seemed cloudy. So you have these quite an explicit memory that she is recording here, 3 different ways that she observed smoke. Now, the other 2 witnesses, Mr. Kabidi, I remember he was preoccupied with waking up his fellow roommates, Ms. Kinfu and Ms. Afewerki, and also going outside to wake up the other occupants of the other flats on the 4th floor, and then going back into his apartment and getting dressed, picking up his cell phone, turning off the main red switch, and then vacating. He was also calling, it's not 911, what is he?
999.
999 here. So there were other things on his mind. Ms. Kinfu, however, is very explicit in her recalling the smoke in that corridor before she vacated.
Now, following on from that point, if I could ask Paul to de-amplify that, but amplify footnote 4. And in the second sentence, in respect to Mr. Kabedi, you say, he also states that he is not sure if he closed the kitchen door behind him or not. Now, stopping there, Were you aware of the thermal imaging camera footage taken by the firefighter first responders when they entered flat 16, and that it certainly appeared from that footage that the kitchen door was closed? Were you aware of that footage?
I was, yes.
Yes. And given that footage, what effect does that have on your analysis of the amount of smoke that could have escaped the kitchen and got into the hallway, thereby triggering the scenario which you've posited in the addendum?
Well, you have to consider the possibility. Certainly was open at one time when Mr. Kabidi looked into the kitchen and observed the fire on the east end of the kitchen near the fridge freezer. He doesn't remember whether he closed it. Was it fully closed, or was it ajar when the fire department came in? So those are issues I have. And could somehow, in some other means, that kitchen door have been left open by Mr. Kabidi and then closed in some other way due to fire heat or someone else? That's possibilities. I don't have an answer.
Okay. Presumably it flows from that. You aren't able to assist us on the amount of smoke that may have escaped the kitchen into the hall between the time of Mr. Kabedi first identifying the fire and making the 999 call.
That's right. I'm not quantifying that, not able to.
And equally, you're not able to give us any idea about the amount of smoke that it would have escaped the kitchen into the hall between the first 999 call and Mr. Kabedi leaving the apartment.
No, I can't distinguish.
Looking at trying to understand the mechanism by which the short circuit occurred, are you able to assist us with how long smoke would need to be at or in the area of the socket in order to penetrate the inner workings and trigger the scenario you posited?
It's almost instantaneous. Once the smoke and soot particles enter the socket and bridge the gap between the ground receiver and the energized receiver, the RCC trips very rapidly, within milliseconds.
Okay. Thank you. Could we now come on to the separate topic of the role of 6B for Bravo in your scenario? And you conclude, and we can turn to page 15 of the addendum just to orientate you in your conclusions. You conclude that it's probable that the overheating of 6 Bravo caused the fire in flat 16. Is that a fair summary of the conclusion you reached in the addendum?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Now, can you explain for us the relationship between the overheating of 6 Bravo and the short circuit you've set out in figure 7, or do you think you've covered it in the evidence you've already given?
Okay, so you have the overheating within the crimp for exhibit JDG 6B as in Bravo, and that becomes a glowing connection over time as the oxide builds up and the resistance builds up and the power losses increase. And once you get that glowing connection, you have the possibility of igniting the wire insulations. Now you have a fire going on within the compressor relay compartment. So now it's a matter of time to bridge that gap between the energized wire, that's JDG 6B, and the neutral wire to cause a short circuit. And those wires are in close proximity to each other within the relay compartment. It's just a matter of time before the insulations are burned off, both of those wires causing a line to neutral short circuit.
Apologies for asking what might be a simple question, but is it the overheating which causes the ignition, or is it the electrical arcing, or is that a false distinction?
The overheating in the crimp starts the fire. It overheats, it glows, it ignites. We don't have a short circuit yet. It's kind of what you call series arcing through those voids. You have glowing electricity, luminous electricity flowing through those voids. It creates heat that ignites the insulation on the wires before you have a short circuit that would trip the circuit breaker.
Thank you very much, Dr. Glover. And now turn to part 3 of the questions that I'd like to ask you in respect to the addendum, and that's more specific questions regarding the reasoning. And Paul, if you could put down the addendum and return to Dr. Glover's report and page 57 of that report, if possible. And you say in the substantive paragraph underneath halfway point, you say, and I quote, "It is concluded that arc damage exhibits MJS1 and JDG1 are consistent with a wire from either the run capacitor or an internal jumper wire within the relay compartment of BPS4. I think this is an extract we looked at earlier when discussing your analysis of the large fridge freezer. Now, having read that, could I ask you to turn back to your addendum and page 9 of the addendum? And if we look at the top paragraph, it says this: Figure 6 shows arc damage exhibit JDG1, which I found within the medium-sized freezer during my 27 April 2018 inspection at Bureau Veritas. There are two possibilities for the location of JDG1 at the time of the fire. Either 1, JDG1 remained within the medium-sized freezer, or 2, JDG1 was initially located outside the medium-sized freezer at the time of the fire and was inadvertently moved into the medium freezer during or after subsequent firefighting efforts. Now, to the lay reader, that suggests that you are less definite that JDG1 formed part of the large fridge freezer. What would be your response to that observation?
Okay, so at the time that I concluded my report, my 15 October report, I hadn't focused on the crimp connector with the voids, JDG6B. Once I saw the voids, when it was able to produce my addendum, I went back and considered the two arc damage exhibits that were found in flat 16, MJS1, JDG1. JDG1 I found in the medium-sized freezer, and we know that there was a problem. Mr. Kabedi had a problem. A fuse was blown many years before the 2017 fire, and putting that together, and now further looking at JDG1, that arc damage wire, which has really 3 wires with 24 strands in it. That would be not quite as consistent as MJS1, which had only 2 wires. Now, it goes back to the motor run capacitor in the fridge freezer that has 2 wires in it, and both of those have 24 strands. So upon looking at JDG1, which had 2 wires but then a 3rd wire, segments in between, that to me made it less likely that that could have been in the fridge freezer, more likely that that came from the medium-sized freezer due to a prior event many years before the 2017 fire. So I ended up concluding that the likelihood of arc damage would have been associated with MJS1 within the fridge freezer.
Thank you. Now, what would be your response to the suggestion that it's at least a possibility that MJS1 was once part of the medium freezer?
First of all, go back to that basic clue. We have circuit 7 that tripped on the night of the fire. Okay. We only have 2 arc damaged exhibits that would be sufficient to trip the circuit breaker for circuit number 7. We just have 2. We have MJS1, we have JDG1. Now, having excluded JDG1 as having come from a prior event, we are only left with 1 arc damaged exhibit from from flat 16 that could have tripped circuit number 7.
Following on from that, is the wire you've identified as MJS1 the only electrical component that you believe is from the fridge freezer that wasn't found near the large fridge freezer?
Yes.
Yeah.
First of all, it's the only arc damaged one, excluding JDG1, and all these other exhibits like JDG6Bs and Bravo and all those were found within the fridge freezer.
Now, apologies for jumping around. If I could we're at the addendum at the moment. If I could ask Paul to turn to page 10 of the addendum. And you state there in the third paragraph on that page, with evidence that exhibit JDG1 arced at a prior time unrelated to the fire. Now, stopping there, can you identify for us what the evidence is that you rely upon for concluding that JDG1 arced before the fire?
This would be basically Mr. Capiti's statement that he had a problem with the medium freezer many years before the fire. He called in a technician from the Yellow Pages, and he had a specific memory of this. Technician told him there was a bad fuse. Mr. Capiti didn't want to fix the problem at that time, but he continued to preserve the medium freezer. So that would be the basic evidence we have, that there was a prior event that caused a fuse to blow.
Apologies for pressing the point, but can you, given that you've considered that JDG1 arced before the fire, why do you exclude the possibility that the damage to MGS1 was arc damage sustained before the fire?
What I'm saying is that, once again, we're left with one piece of arc damage that would have been sufficient to trip the circuit breaker for circuit number 7. That's MJS1. So that's how I conclude that it was somehow, at one point, it was connected to circuit 7, that it was energized from circuit 7 within the kitchen. Now, I'm assuming that this is an electrical fire. As I mentioned, I'm not a cause and origin expert. I have no opinion on whether this was a non-electrical fire caused by a lit candle or a smoldering cigarette. I'm assuming we have an electrical fire here, and I'll leave it to the fire investigators to tell the inquiry whether this was was a non-electrical fire. So if we have an electrical fire, we're left with MJS1, the only arc damage exhibit that, in my opinion, could have tripped circuit 7 for the kitchen. And that would happen before the fire, obviously. We have an abnormal electrical event, trips the circuit breaker, the fire starts.
Maybe I should have asked this question earlier on, but it flows from what you've just said, is whilst we have the benefit of the guidance you identified in the damage assessment memo, we have the listing of the 9 characteristics of arc damage. How straightforward is it to identify arc damage as a general proposition?
It does take experience. It's someone who has experience looking at arc damage wires, has reviewed the literature. I've mentioned NFPA 921, the Guide to Fire Investigations, and there are some very explicit, we listed 9 of them, things to look for. The fine line of demarcation between the localized damaged and the undamaged, the copper beads, arc beads, the opposing wire, you've got to have arc from one to another. All of these things I saw the clear evidence of arc damage to MJS1.
Okay. Now, can I move on to a separate topic, which is looking at more particular about MJS1 again? Now, it may well assist if we put up a photo, Paul, which can be found at WPL, I think, *000 3234, and internal page 23.
Can I just intervene? Are you still happy going on?
Yes, sir.
You don't need a break yet.
It is actually a convenient place to stop if
Well,
that
I mean,
helps.
we can, I just wanted to make sure that Dr. Glover wasn't sitting there thinking he'd had enough for the morning.
I'm fine.
He's fine. So you find
Okay.
whatever time suits you.
I think we're having some difficulty locating the photo at the moment. Paul, do you have the reference? It's WPL, *0 03234. go. And if we could go to page 29, you're at page 23 there, so I need to go on 6 pages using the relativity numbering. There we go. And if we can amplify figure 8. Now, apologies, just for context, it's necessary to rehash a question I asked earlier, but is the design of the compressor in the exemplar, which is shown there, is that different to the one you found in the large fridge freezer in flat 16?
Yes, this is an exemplar, and the way you identify this particular compressor is there's a blue logo. It's actually in this company. The logo of this company is Tecumseh.
And sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Glover. There's the compressor unit which sits roughly in the middle of the photograph. There's 2 labels in the centre of the compressor.
Yes.
We're looking at the top label, and there's a blue logo to the far left-hand side.
Correct. So this is the compressor. There are 2 labels on the compressor. There's a warning label below, and there is a manufacturer's label, and in the upper left corner there is what I call a blue logo. That is the logo of Tecumseh. It's actually a Native American headdress. Tecumseh, Tecumseh, is a Native American name. So this is not the Embraco compressor that was within the subject fridge freezer from flat 16.
Now, understood. Is the design of the exemplar different to the design of the index fridge freezer that was in the kitchen at flat 16?
Not significantly, no. I mean, you have the compressor. To the left of that, you have what we've been calling the compressor relay compartment. This is a plastic enclosure that plugs into the compressor. Both of these features, there might be some small differences, would be applied to the Tecumseh model that you see here, as well as the Embraco. Well, you also have the run capacitor over here, which runs into the compressor relay compartment. These are all general. They would apply to both models.
Would there be any difference in the wiring layout of the index fridge freezer and the exemplar fridge freezer?
There are some differences. As I mentioned, the wiring harness with 5 wires that come down from within the freezer is slightly different from this exemplar. It's still 5 wires, but one of them, the wires are within a cord with another jacket, and for the other, they're not. The actual size of the compressor relay compartment might be different for both, but generally they're similar.
Now, are the components within the compressor relay compartment enclosed within the housing? And I think the housing is to the left of the compressor.
Yes.
Yeah. That's a yes.
Yes, those would be the 2 relays, the PTC relay and the Clixon relay, and the wires and wire connectors.
Okay. Now, Paul, can you put away that photograph and put up a separate photograph which is MET quadruple 0 9047. Now, I think and hope and expect this is a post-fire photograph of a compressor relay. Is that right?
Yes, so this is not one of my photos, but this is the compressor.
And if I can stop you there, hopefully that also shows Exhibit 6 Bravo. Is that right?
On this front, as we're visualizing here, if you looked at the rear of the refrigerator, it would be on the left, but we're facing the compressor relay compartment. The plastic enclosure is now missing. It's been consumed in the fire. And what you are looking at are up here, I believe it's the Clixon relay, down up here, and down here is the PTC. It's hard to see, and there are a number of wires with connectors on them One of them is JDG6B as in Bravo, as well as JDG6A and 6C and the other. All of those wires came from this area, which was Exhibit BPS4, the compressor from the fridge freezer in flat 16.
Thank you, Doctor. And just to flow from that, are you able to confirm that you've examined all the wires that are illustrated in this photograph?
Okay, now I never saw this as it is in this photo. This was then disassembled during laboratory investigations that I was not present at. And certain items were put into certain evidence bags, Ziploc bags, and labeled with different components. And so I was looking at various components that were taken from this compressor relay compartment. Were they all there? I looked at everything that was shown to me, and I carefully examined everything that was presented to me. Can I say that there's something here that I didn't look at? I can't say that. So.
And I suppose the next question is, did you find any arc damage on the wires that you believe to have come from the compressor relay?
No, there was no arc damage. The only arc damage was MJS1 and JDG1.
Okay. Can I ask Paul to put away that photograph and return to your addendum, Dr. Glover, and could I ask you to turn to page 5 of that addendum? I'm going to now turn to some specific questions regarding the various exhibits illustrated there in Figure 1. First question is this: were 6A and 6C and the longest wire from 6F from the longest wire from 6F from the run capacitor, as they are all 24-strand conductors?
The short answer to that is yes. If you look at JDG 6A in the lower right corner, that's a connector. And the CT scans that showed that there were 24 strands of a wire within JDG 6A. Moving to the center, JDG 6C is another connector with a wire in it, and the CT scan showed that there were 24 strands associated with that connector and wire. And then there's a third wire up here, JDG 6F. I believe it's this one of the other wires that did not have a connector associated with it. It was just a wire segment, also had 24 strands. And by process of elimination, I concluded that those were basically run capacitor wires.
And would those wires have been contained within the compressor relay compartment?
In my opinion, yes. JDG 6C and A are definitely right in the compressor relay compartment. And of course, they're wire segments now. I would associate this 24-strand wire over here with this connector because there's nothing left. So there had to be a wire here. It's most likely that it was this F, which also has 24 strands. Okay. This JDG 6C has a connector, but also has a wire with 24 strands. So I would put these definitely right within the compressor relay compartment.
Now, tying this together with MJS1, in previous answers, you've confirmed that the length of a MJS1 was 10 centimetres, or approximately thereabouts. Do you think, or have you concluded, that MJS1 was located within the compressor relay compartment?
I have concluded that it is most likely, it is probable that the fused area of MJS1 was located in the compressor relay compartment. To the left of that fused area are 7, 8, 9 centimeters that most likely projected out of the relay compartment and were headed toward the run capacitor.
Would it help if we went back to look at some photos of MJS1?
Yes.
Paul, could you put this down? Could you go back to JDGR 000 006 _ 002? So JDGR 000 006, that's the one. Now, if we could amplify, I think, the top figure, Dr. Glover, is probably the most helpful. Is that right?
I would take the bottom figure simply because there is a scale on there.
Okay, if we could amplify the bottom one, Paul. And Dr. Glover, can you confirm for us the fuse section? I think you were saying, correct me if I'm wrong, the fuse section was contained, you think, within the relay.
Yes, here's the fuse section, about 1.5 centimeters from this end of MJS1. In my opinion, that was located within the compressor relay compartment of the fridge freezer.
And the rest extruded.
At some point, this would have exited the compressor relay compartment and continued on to the run capacitor, which is further over to the left behind at the lower rear of the fridge freezer.
Thank you. And if, Paul, if we can take away that photo and return to the addendum and figure 1 at page 5.
May I ask a question? Is it possible to have a split screen and show both of those figures at the same time?
It is. He says optimistically.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Now, given the analysis you've carried out, Paul, if I could ask you to amplify that, thank you, figure 1 on the left-hand side, are you able to say whether MJS1 is the continuation of the capacitor wires 6C and 6F?
Basically, yes.
And can you help us why you can say that? Or why you
Okay.
think you can say that?
So 6C and 6A, these are connectors. These are the crimp connectors. Those will plug in within the relay compressor compartment. They had to be, these connectors had to be within the compressor relay compartment. That's a start.
Okay, the next question, therefore, is which end of MJS1, illustrated in the right-hand box, would have been closer to the broken wires 6C and 6F?
Okay, so here's my analysis. Let's take 6C. This is within the relay compartment. Here's the wire.
Yep.
It's about 7 centimeters if you look at this scale. It's about 7 centimeters of wire. That would have been connected, in my opinion, to the right end, about which it itself is 1.5 centimeters from the fused area of MJS1. So here's 6C, which this wire would connect to one of these wires, and here's 6A, which connects to this wire, also with 24 strands, which then connects to the other wire on the right end of MJS1.
Understood.
So what you end up with is about 7 centimeters here, another 1.5 centimeters here, 8.5 centimeters. That's about 3.2 inches.
Thank you.
3 inches of wire that, in my opinion, would have fit quite comfortably within the compressor relay compartment.
Dr. Glover, thank you. Sir, that is a very convenient point at which to break.
Yes. All right. And you seem to be getting on quite rapidly.
We are not much further to go.
No. Right. Well, Dr. Glover, we'll stop at that point so we can all have some lunch. There will be some more questions after when we come back.
Thank you, sir.
I'm going to ask you please not to talk about your evidence over the break. And if you'd like to go with the usher, we'll start again at 2 o'clock, please.
Thank you, sir.
All right? Thank you very much. Good. 2 o'clock, please. Thank you.